Wherever and whenever you're hearing this, welcome. Please leave a comment to tell us where you are listening from in the world, what time it is, and who your team is. It would be great to see, and maybe play a small part in bringing people together through the magic of football. Welcome to the early history of one of the world's greatest sporting competitions. We are going on a journey today. A journey that begins in the autumn of 1871, in a country that looks almost nothing like the one we live in now. A country where most people don't yet have the right to vote. A country where football, association football, the game we know and love, is barely a decade old and still desperately trying to work out what it even is. A country where the word professional in sport is practically an insult, where the idea of paying a man to kick a ball around a field would have made a Victorian gentleman shave his mutton chops. And yet, in that curious, soot-stained, gaslit world, a small group of men, secretaries, teachers, civil servants, a few gentlemen of leisure, sat down and decided to organize a competition. They called it the Football Association Challenge Cup. Most people just called it the Cup. And 150 years later, we still do. What we're going to do today is go through the first 25 seasons of that competition, one by one. We're going to meet the teams. We're going to meet the players. We're going to understand what was at stake, not just on the pitch, but off it. In the changing rooms, in the committee rooms, in the streets and factories and mill towns that produce the people who played. We're going to watch a competition that starts as a rather gentlemanly affair dominated by public school old boys and ends, by our 25th season, having been completely revolutionized by the industrial north of England. This is not just football history, this is social history. This is the story of how a sport grew up, and how a country changed, and how the two things are inextricably connected. So, let's go back to 1871. Let's go back to the very beginning. Lie back, relax, and let the football commence. But before we do, I want to plant one image in your mind. I want you to imagine two different scenes in two different Saturdays in English football, separated by exactly 25 years. The first Saturday, the 16th of March, 1872. The Kennington Oval, South London. A cricket ground in the middle of winter, the grass muddy and churned. About 2,000 people are watching, which is not a great roaring crowd. A modest gathering, most of them wrapped in heavy coats against the March chill. The players on the pitch went to Eton and Harrow. Their fathers are in Parliament and the Army. After the game, some of them will go to their respective clubs in West London. Some will be at their desks in the city on Monday morning. Nobody is being paid to play. The trophy, when it is presented, costs £20 and is the size of a large coffee pot. The second Saturday, 18th of April, 1896. Crystal Palace, South London. An enormous open ground on a hillside with views across the city. 836 people are watching, working men mostly, who've travelled from Sheffield and Wolverhampton on special excursion trains laid on for the occasion. The players on the pitch are paid professionals, some of them among the highest earners in England. Nobody went to Eton. The sport has been so completely transformed in these 25 years that it would be almost unrecognizable to a spectator who'd attended only the first final and then somehow skipped forward to this one. That transformation, that extraordinary, headlong, sometimes chaotic transformation, is what we're here to talk about today. The first 25 FA Cups are not just 25 football matches. They're a compressed documentary history of one of the most significant social changes in Victorian England, the democratization of sport. The moment when football stopped belonging to a handful of privileged men and became permanently the game of the people. Right. Now, let's go back to 1871. Before we even get to the first ball being kicked, we need to understand what the Football Association was and why it wanted a cup competition in the first place. This context matters. Without it, the story of these first 25 cups is just a list of results. With it, it becomes something far richer, a story about who controls sport, about who it belongs to, and about the great unstoppable forces of Victorian industrial society pressing against each other until something gives. Think about England in 1871. Victoria has been on the throne for 34 years, and will be on it for another 30. Gladstone is Prime Minister. The population of England and Wales is about 22 million people. London is the largest city in the world, the financial and commercial capital of a global empire on which, it is said with complete sincerity, the sun never sets. Britain makes more steel than the rest of the world combined. Its navy rules every ocean. Its banks finance half the globe. And yet most of its people live in conditions we would find shocking. Life expectancy for a working-class man in an industrial town is perhaps 40 years. Housing is overcrowded. Working hours are brutal. The 10-hour day had only been legislated in 1847. Children still work in mills and mines. Women have no vote and almost no legal rights. The divide between the comfortable classes and the working poor is total and immovable. Different worlds existing side by side. Into this world, football arrives, not from nowhere, but in its modern, organized, rule-bound form. And it arrives first in the public schools, carried by the sons of the ruling class, before spreading outward in ways nobody quite anticipated or controlled. The Football Association had been founded in 1863, just 8 years before our story begins. It was founded at the Freemasons' Tavern in London, which gives you a fairly good idea of the social milieu we're operating in. The men who formed it were largely from the public school, Eton, Harrow, Charterhouse, and they were trying to create a unified set of rules for the game. Before 1863, every school, every club, every village played by its own rules. Some allowed handling the ball. Some allowed hacking, literally kicking your opponent in the shins hard as a tactical maneuver. Some were played on pitches the size of small counties with no fixed number of players per side. It was glorious, anarchic chaos. The FA brought order to all this chaos, or tried to. But what it needed desperately was a way to bring clubs together, to give the game a focal point, a reason to compete beyond just the local and the parochial. The rules that the FA established in 1863 are worth mentioning, because understanding them helps you understand the game we're watching in these early cup matches. The FA's rules prohibited hacking. You couldn't kick an opponent in the shins. They prohibited handling the ball except by the goalkeeper. They established fixed team sizes and a fixed pitch. These seem obvious to us, but every one of these rules was fiercely contested. The rugby-playing faction, who wanted hacking allowed, walked out of the founding meeting and went on to create rugby union. This schism between football and rugby, over the question of hacking of all things, shaped English sporting culture for the next 160 years. Within football itself, the rules kept evolving throughout the 1860s and 1870s. The offside rule changed multiple times. The throw-in was introduced and its rules modified. The goalkeeper's area of operation was defined and redefined. Crossbars replaced tape strung between the posts. Corner kicks and free kicks were introduced. By the time the FA Cup started in 1871, the game was recognizably the same sport we play today, but only just. Watching an 1871 match, you'd feel as if you were watching football through slightly distorted glass. The same shapes, the same patterns, but something not quite right. A goal scored by a player who's clearly onside by modern rules being disallowed because the 1871 offside rules required 3 players between you and the goal rather than 2. A keeper charging 30 yards from his goal to play the ball with his hands. A throw-in thrown directly into goal as an attempted shot. These things happened. It was Charles Alcock who had the idea. Alcock was the FA's honorary secretary, a young man, only 29 in 1871, and he had been inspired by something he'd seen at school at Harrow, a knockout cup competition between schoolhouses. He proposed something similar for the FA's member clubs, a challenge cup, a knockout tournament. One bad day and you're out, winner takes all. It's worth appreciating just how radical this idea was. Most sporting competition at the time was about friendly matches between clubs. There was no league, no promotion, no official standings of any kind. The idea of a definitive competition with a definitive winner was completely new. The FA committee approved the idea in July 1871. Alcock, as honorary secretary, drew up the rules for the new competition, and they were remarkably simple. There would be a draw. The winners of each match progressed. Those who lost were eliminated. Continue until one team remained. It really was that straightforward, and the simplicity of the concept is part of its genius. There is no fairer way to decide a champion, and no more brutal one. The trophy itself, That famous little silver-plated pot, or rather the first version of it, was made by a Sheffield-based silversmiths and cost £20. It went by the nickname the Little Tin Idol, which is somewhat uncharitable given that it was actually silver-plated. £20, adjusted for inflation, that is roughly £2,000 in 2026 money, for the most famous football trophy in the world. The cup stood about 18 inches tall, with 2 looped handles and a lid. It looked, to modern eyes, rather like a very grand sugar bowl, but to the men who competed for it from 1872 to 1895, it was everything. Martin Hall and Company of Sheffield were one of the great Victorian silversmithing firms, which is a nice coincidence given that Sheffield was also the city that had done more than any other to popularize football through the Sheffield FA. The trophy was made in Sheffield, the rules of the game were largely established in Sheffield, and the world's oldest football club was from Sheffield. If football had a spiritual home in Victorian England, Sheffield had some claim to it. It was presented to the winners of every cup final, up until it was stolen in 1895. But we'll get to that scandal perhaps at a later date. 15 clubs entered the first competition. Just 15. Let that sink in, because today we have hundreds. Those 15 clubs were almost exclusively from London and the surrounding area, because that's where most FA member clubs were at the time. Northern clubs were beginning to emerge, but they weren't yet affiliated. The clubs were Barnes, Civil Service, Crystal Palace, not the modern one. This was a completely different club. Donington School, Hampstead Heathens, Harrow Checkers, Hitchin, Lausanne, Maidenhead, Marlow, Queen's Park from Glasgow, the one notable exception to the southern dominance, Reigate Priory, Royal Engineers, Upton Park, and Wanderers. Let's just spend a moment with some of these names, because they are delightful. Hampstead Heathens. Named, presumably after Hampstead Heath, the common land in North London where they presumably played their home games. You can picture it, gentlemen in knee-length trousers and long-sleeved shirts, kicking a ball around the heath while dogs run through the game and respectable Victorian families stroll past and look disapproving. Lausanne, a Swiss club, the only foreign entry in the competition's history, who didn't actually travel to England for their match and withdrew without playing. Donington School, a boys' school from Lincolnshire whose students competed against men. Reigate Priory, a Surrey club from a market town representing football in its most bucolic, far-from-the-mill town's form. And then at the other end of the spectrum, Royal Engineers. Military professionals, Queen's Park. The Wanderers. These were serious clubs with serious players. The competition contained both, the whimsical and the genuinely formidable, which is itself very characteristic of the FA Cup across its entire history. The Cup has always made room for both the minnows and the giants. That democratic impulse, present from the very first year, is one of the things that makes it unlike any other competition. These names may ring a bell if you know your football history. Within about 10 years, most of these clubs will have vanished or declined into obscurity, replaced by the powerhouses of the industrial north. But for now, these are the pioneers. These are the men who started it all. Let's talk about the format, because it was slightly different from what you might expect. In the first few years, the competition wasn't a strict single elimination bracket from the start. Teams could withdraw, buys were common, and the logistics were frankly a bit chaotic. This was amateur hour in the most literal sense. There were no floodlights, games were played in the afternoon, at the mercy of winter daylight. There were no changing rooms at most grounds. Players turned up already in their kit. There were no match officials in the modern sense. Disputes were handled by umpires from each side, and if they couldn't agree, they appealed to a referee. Note that the referee was the fallback, not the primary authority. Pitches were whatever was available, public parks, school fields, the occasional private ground, and into this wonderful shambles stepped 15 clubs, ready to make history. Now the FA Cup season, 1870-71. Let's start with what happened in the very first round. Because the very first FA Cup tie ever played was between Barnes and Civil Service, on the 11th of November 1871. Barnes won 2-0. That's your opening chapter. 2 London clubs, probably watched by a few dozen spectators at most, in a field that was more mud than grass in November. Nobody had any idea they were making history. The Barnes players probably went home, had their tea, went to work the next morning, and thought very little more about it. But history is often made quietly, unremarkably, in muddy fields by people who don't know they're doing anything significant. And the first FA Cup tie was no exception. The competition quickly threw up its first truly interesting character, Queen's Park of Glasgow. Queen's Park were at this time arguably the best club in Britain, not just Scotland but Britain. They played a sophisticated passing game that was completely ahead of its time. While most English clubs were still essentially playing a dribbling game, one man running with the ball as long as he could before being tackled, Queen's Park had developed the short passing style that we would now recognize as proper football. Move the ball, create space, use your teammates. It sounds obvious to us. In 1871, it was revolutionary. They drew their semi-final against Wanderers, which was itself an achievement. But here's where geography intervened. Queen's Park couldn't afford to come back to London for the replay. The train journey, the accommodation, the time away from work. It was simply beyond their means, so they withdrew. And with that withdrawal, a tantalizing alternative history evaporated. What if Queen's Park had won the very first FA Cup? The Scottish and English football stories might have intertwined much earlier, but it wasn't to be. That withdrawal would haunt Scottish football's relationship with the FA Cup for decades. And so to the final. March 1872. The Kennington Oval. Yes, the cricket ground. Surrey's ground. This is where the first FA Cup final was played, and the choice tells you a lot about the state of football in 1872. There simply weren't purpose-built football grounds of sufficient size. The Oval was one of the few enclosed grounds in London where you could actually charge an entrance fee and control the crowd. Cricket grounds were the infrastructure football used in its infancy. The finalists were Wanderers and Royal Engineers. The Wanderers were a curious club, and the name tells you everything. They had no home ground. They were literally Wanderers, a nomadic team of public school alumni who played their home games at whichever ground they could borrow. Their key man was Morton Peto-Betts, who scored the only goal of the game, though he played under the pseudonym R. Checker, which was apparently the done thing if you were a Harrowman playing for a mixed club. Royal Engineers were something different entirely. A team of serving military officers, they brought to football the same qualities that made their branch of the army so formidable: discipline, organization, tactical thinking. They were tremendous athletes, professional soldiers in peak physical condition, and they played what was for the time a remarkably organized team game. But on the day, Wanderers were better. The attendance was around 2,000 people. Gate receipts, £100. The cup was presented without any great ceremony, and then everyone went home. But history had been made. The FA Cup existed. The template was set. The playing conditions at the Oval in these years deserve a moment of description, because they were significantly different from anything we'd recognize today. The Oval was a cricket ground, and cricket grounds are designed with cricket in mind. The pitch runs north to south, the boundary is roughly circular, and the playing surface in March, when the Cup finals were held, was in its post-winter worst condition. The Oval's grass would have been thin and muddy after the winter, the surface uneven, the drainage, by modern standards, virtually non-existent. Players wore heavy boots, thick wool shirts, and long trousers. If the weather was wet, and this being England in March, it often was, the ball became heavy and difficult to control within minutes. Heading a wet leather ball was an act of considerable courage. The goalkeepers had it particularly hard. They could handle the ball anywhere on the pitch. And in the 1870s and early 1880s, many of them did, charging out into open play, effectively functioning as an outfield player who happened to also guard the net. This was gradually changing as the decade progressed, and the rules around goalkeeping were tightened, but in the early cups, a goalkeeper who stayed in his goal the whole game would have been considered timid and unhelpful. Let's linger a moment longer on that first final, because it deserves more than a quick summary. The two teams who contested it represent two very different ideas about what football could be. The Wanderers were a team of essentially rootless gentlemen, educated, connected. Among their number were men who had played at Harrow, Eton, and Oxford. Morton Peto-Betts, who scored the winning goal under his pseudonym R. Checker, was a cricketer of some note as well as a footballer. The team had no fixed home, no squad, no local community to represent. They were, in the most literal possible sense, playing for the love of the game. The idea that anyone should receive payment for kicking a football would have struck most of them as not merely unnecessary but rather vulgar. The Royal Engineers, meanwhile, were something more purposeful. Their approach to football was organized and systematic in a way that reflected their military training. They had identified years before most clubs had that the way to win at football was not to find your best dribbler and let him run at people, but to pass the ball, move as a unit, cover for each other. Their captain, Lieutenant Henry Rennie Tayleur, was an outstanding all-round sportsman who also represented Scotland at rugby. Their left winger, Lieutenant Edmund Creswell, played the final despite a broken collarbone. He arrived in a sling and had to remove it to play. This is either magnificent sporting dedication or spectacular stubbornness, possibly both. In the end, one goal settled it. Betts scored the only goal, and Wanderers became the first FA Cup winners. The trophy was presented, the players shook hands, and 150 years of history began. What strikes me most, looking back at that first competition, is how completely unaware everyone involved was of what they were starting. Nobody wrote in their diary that night, "Today I participated in the birth of the most popular sporting competition in the history of the world." They ate their dinner. They read their evening papers. They went to bed. And the little tin idol sat in a cupboard somewhere waiting for next year. Final score: Wanderers 1, Royal Engineers 0. An attendance of 2,000 saw the proceedings at Kennington Oval. The second FA Cup, season 1872-73. The competition grew slightly in its second year. The same basic cast of characters, but with a few more clubs entering, and a growing sense that this competition was worth taking seriously. And the same result, almost Wanderers again. Before we get to the final, let's think about what was happening more broadly. England in 1872-73 is a country of extraordinary contrasts. London is the financial capital of the world, the centre of a vast empire, but in the industrial north, in the mill towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, in the steel cities of Sheffield and Birmingham, a different England exists. One of factory whistles and 12-hour shifts and children who start work at 8 years old. Football is beginning to take root in these places, played on scraps of open land wherever workers can find them. The FA Cup in 1872 knows nothing about this world, but in 10 years it will be defined by it. The holders, Wanderers, were given a bye directly to the final, a privilege extended to the cup holders for the first few years, which would now seem absolutely absurd, but made a certain kind of sense in an era when the logistics of running a full knockout tournament were genuinely difficult. Oxford University appeared in the competition for the first time this year, and would go on to be a significant force in the early cup. Donington School also entered, and just let that name wash over you, a school in a cup competition with adult clubs. This tells you everything about how fluid and inclusive the early competition was. Oxford University faced Wanderers in the final, again at the Oval. Wanderers won 2-0. The hero this time was Robert Vidal, but really the hero of these early years is Arthur Kinnaird. Let me tell you about Arthur Kinnaird. You cannot tell the story of the early FA Cup without him. Lord Arthur Kinnaird, no less, eventually the 11th Baron Kinnaird, was one of the most extraordinary figures in Victorian sport. He played in 9 FA Cup finals. 9. That record stood for over a century. He was tall, athletic, and had a magnificent red beard that made him instantly recognizable on any football pitch. He played with a ferocity and commitment that rather belied his aristocratic background. His mother apparently once told an FA official that she was afraid her son would come home one day with a broken leg, to which the official replied, and excused this attempt at a Scottish accent, "Dinna worry, my lady, it'll no be his ain." He was also, in later life, FA president for 33 years, from 1890 to 1923, a tenure that spanned the entire transformation of football from gentleman's recreation to mass professional sport. The man is basically the spirit of the early FA Cup made flesh. One small additional detail about Kinnaird's footballing style that deserves mention: he was, by all accounts, physically intimidating. Not in a dirty or malicious way, he was never suspended or expelled from any match, but in the manner of someone who simply plays the game at full intensity without any thought of personal preservation. Think more Terry Hurlock than Vinnie Jones. He tackled hard, challenged hard in the air heading, remember, was not yet the standard technique. It was considered rather unsophisticated. But Kinnaird did it anyway when it seemed advantageous, and competed for every ball as if his life depended on it. At least one opponent was apparently knocked clean off the pitch by one of his challenges, and landed in the crowd. The crowd in the 1870s was not penned behind barriers, but simply standing around the edge of the pitch. To understand Kinnaird properly, you need to understand what it meant to be a wealthy young Victorian with a passion for sport, in an era before television, before radio, before really any form of mass entertainment as we understand it. Sport was one of the primary ways in which public life was conducted. Cricket, horse racing, rowing, boxing, and now football. These were the arenas in which men of Kinnaird's class performed, competed, and defined themselves. And Kinnaird threw himself into all of it with a gusto that was almost alarming. He was everywhere. He played in every competition, sat on every committee, refereed when required, administered when asked. He devoted himself to football with a totality that we would now recognize as professionalism, even though he was the last man on earth to accept payment for any of it. His 9 final appearances would span 1873 to 1883, a decade during which the entire social composition of the cup would shift beneath him. He would go from playing alongside fellow Eton men against other public school teams, to facing working-class professional players from Lancashire, who played with a ferocity and determination that had nothing to do with gentlemanly recreation. He adapted. He competed. He was, throughout, a sportsman of great quality. The second cup also shows us something interesting about the format's early development. Having given Wanderers a bye to the final, the FA needed to run a proper knockout competition for everyone else, and the knockout format produced its first real drama. Oxford University's C.J. Channery scored twice to beat Crystal Palace, the old one, 3-2 in one of the earlier rounds, in what was reported as an excellent open game. Even in the competition's infancy, the cup was capable of generating more excitement and narrative. Final score: Wanderers 2, Oxford University 0. Some 3,000 people made their way to Lily Bridge to witness the occasion. The third FA Cup, season 1873 to 74. The third cup saw the first proper stirrings of change. Oxford University won it, beating Royal Engineers in the final 2-0, but more interesting than the result is what's happening at the edges of the competition. More clubs are affiliating with the FA. The competition is spreading slowly northward. Sheffield, which had its own football association with its own slightly different rules, is beginning to engage properly with the FA. The game is growing. Oxford's win was built around the extraordinary Cuthbert Ottaway, who deserves a moment of appreciation because he is one of the most remarkable sportsmen of the Victorian era. Ottaway is notable for having captained the very first England football team in the first ever international match against Scotland in November 1872. He was a genuine all-round sporting genius, first-class cricketer, fine tennis player, one of the best footballers of his age. He died young, at just 27, of complications following a football injury. What he might have achieved with a full sporting life is one of those melancholy what-ifs that history occasionally throws up. The Royal Engineers were becoming the nearly men of the early cup. They'd reached the final 3 times in the first 4 years without winning it, a remarkable record of consistent excellence combined with devastating bad luck. Technically superb, tactically ahead of their time, their use of passing rather than dribbling was innovative, but somehow always falling just short. You begin to feel a real sympathy for them. Part of the problem for the Engineers was that their best players kept moving on. The military posted officers around the country and around the empire. You couldn't build continuity the way a civilian club could. It was a structural disadvantage they could never quite overcome. Still, 3 finals in 4 years, not to be sniffed at. The 1873-74 competition also saw the first hints of what would become a defining feature of the cup, the giant killing. Shropshire Wanderers, a club from the Welsh Marches, an area with almost no footballing tradition at this point, entered and beat a couple of southern clubs before going out. They had no business even being competitive, but the cup's format, with its single elimination drama, meant that on any given day preparation and luck and a bit of spirit could trump greater ability. That lesson would be learned and relearned hundreds of times in the cup's history. The football itself, in this third competition, was becoming slightly more sophisticated. The long ball game, hoofing the ball forward and running, was gradually giving way, in the better clubs, to a more considered approach. Oxford University under Ottaway played with what contemporaries described as combination, the passing game, and it was more effective against the best sides than the old dribbling style. The game was evolving rapidly even in these very early years because the cup was forcing clubs to take it seriously. You had to think about how to beat your opponents, not just outrun or outmuscle them. Final score: Oxford University 2, Royal Engineers 0. A crowd of 2,000 gathered at Kennington Oval to see the Cup won. The 4th FA Cup, season 1874-75. Royal Engineers finally got their reward. They beat Old Etonians 2-0 in the final at the Kennington Oval to claim their first and only FA Cup. It was a sweet, overdue, thoroughly deserved victory for a team that had done everything right, played beautiful, progressive football, and kept coming so agonizingly close without the ultimate prize. Old Etonians. Now there's a name for you. A team made up of old boys of Eton College, the most famous school in England. These were aristocrats and sons of aristocrats, men who would go on to run the empire, sit in the House of Lords, command armies and navies. The school has educated more prime ministers than any other institution, and they were very, very good at football. There is a slightly dizzying quality to contemplating these cup finals of the 1870s, and realizing that the men on the pitch might include the future Foreign Secretary, a couple of future generals, and someone who would end up as a colonial governor of somewhere very hot. They'd reach many more finals before the great transformation came. The Engineers captain, Francis Marindin, would later become president of the FA and referee several FA Cup finals himself, quite a career arc, from lifting the trophy to handing it out. He was a tremendous servant to the game, deeply committed to the FA's mission of spreading and codifying football. One thing worth mentioning about this era: the rules of the game were still evolving. The crossbar on the goal wasn't yet universal. Some games were still played with just 2 posts. Heading the ball was not yet well established as a technique. Goalkeepers could handle the ball anywhere on the pitch, not just in their own area. Football in 1875 would look recognizable to a modern eye, but strange, like a dream version of the game. The crowd at this final was around 3,000, but the cup was becoming something. People were beginning to notice. The sporting press was beginning to pay attention. Something was stirring. Sporting press in 1875 was a fascinating thing. Bell's Life in London, The Sportsman, The Field, these were the papers that covered sport for a general audience, and they were beginning to realize that football was worth reporting properly, not just a line or two, but actual match reports. Descriptions of the play, assessments of individual performances, the language of football journalism was being invented in real time, and if you read these reports from the 1870s, you can feel the writers reaching for new words and new frameworks to describe what they were seeing. They borrowed from cricket reporting, from rowing reporting, from boxing. They called goals rouges sometimes, carrying over terminology from other games. They described a well-executed passing move as a combination, a word that would persist in football vocabulary for decades. And the Royal Engineers win in 1875 was a gift to this emerging press. Here was a story: the nearly men who'd been so close for so long, finally getting their moment. Marindin lifting the trophy, the crowd cheering. A narrative that even people who'd never watched football could understand and appreciate. The cup was generating the kind of stories that fill sports columns. It was becoming, in its modest way, a national event. The Engineers celebrated their victory at a dinner in London that evening, attended by officials of the FA and representatives of the competing clubs. The speeches, apparently, were rather good. Marindin spoke about the future of the game, about its potential to spread across the country. He had no idea how right he was. Final score: Royal Engineers 1. Old Etonians won with an attendance of 2,000. The replay saw Royal Engineers beat Old Etonians 2-0. Kennington Oval played host to 3,000 supporters for the deciding match. The 5th FA Cup, season 1875-76. Wanderers were back. Of course they were back. This was essentially Wanderers' competition. They'd already won it twice, and they had the personnel to win it again. They beat Old Etonians 1-0 in a replay. Yes, another replay. The first final had ended 1-1. The rules required them to come back. There was no extra time yet, no penalty shootout. Those things were decades away. If it was a draw, you came back and did it again, which on one hand seems wonderfully old-fashioned, and on the other hand makes a certain amount of sense. You want a definitive winner, and you want to give both teams a fair chance. The first match, the 1-1 draw, was played at the Oval on March 11, 1876. The replay was a week later at the Lily Bridge ground in West London. Wanderers were dominant in the replay. The 3-0 scoreline tells its own story, and the Old Etonians could have few complaints. This final introduced another character worth noting, William Kenyon Slaney, who scored for Wanderers in the original match. He was a Coldstream Guards officer, a big athletic man who played with considerable physical presence. He later became a Member of Parliament. Again, this is the world of the early FA Cup. Parliamentarians, military officers, gentlemen of leisure, football as a sport of the educated elite, but things are about to change, dramatically. I want to add one more observation about the Fifth Cup before we move on, the growing importance of fitness and preparation. The Wanderers of the mid-1870s were not, by any modern standard, fit athletes. They were active, energetic men who played football regularly, but they did not train in any systematic way. There was no running program, no dietary advice, no strength conditioning. They played matches, and that was essentially their preparation for more matches. The northern clubs that were developing in this period were beginning quietly to do things differently. They were playing more matches, internal games, practice matches, matches against local opposition, throughout the week. Their players were developing the kind of match fitness that comes only from playing constantly. This is one of the underappreciated reasons why the northern clubs were eventually so much better than the southern ones. They simply played more football. The gentleman amateurs 1 game a week simply could not compete with the working man who played football 3 or 4 times a week and had done so since childhood. The 1875-76 competition had 32 entries, more than double the original 15. The Cup was drawing in clubs from an ever wider geographic area. Clapham Rovers, who will win the Cup in a few years, are becoming a force. Oxford University keep reaching the late rounds. And for the first time, Sheffield clubs are entering in meaningful numbers. Sheffield FC, the world's oldest football club, had been playing their own version of the game under Sheffield rules rather than FA rules. But the rules were converging, and clubs from the Steel City were beginning to take the national competition seriously. The Sheffield clubs would bring something new to the FA Cup, a playing style shaped by their own tradition, physically direct and hard-edged. Sheffield football had always been a contact sport. The FA's rules had gradually tamed some of the more extreme physical play that the early game had featured, the hacking, the charging from behind, but Sheffield clubs still played with a directness that the more technical southern clubs sometimes found difficult to cope with. This north-south stylistic contrast would be a recurring theme throughout the Cup's early history. Final score: Wanderers 3, Old Etonians 0 after a replay. The original match ended 1-1 in front of 3,500 at Kennington Oval, with 1,500 attending the replay. The 6th FA Cup, season 1876-77. Wanderers' extraordinary dominance of the early Cup is one of the great unsung stories in English football. They beat Oxford University 2-1 in a final that many observers thought Oxford should have won, coming from behind to claim the victory. Arthur Kinnaird was everywhere, as usual, his red beard unmistakable, his energy apparently inexhaustible. But here's what you need to understand about 1877. The world outside the FA Cup is changing in ways that will, within a few years, completely transform the competition. In the industrial towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, football is exploding in popularity. Not the gentleman's game of the public schools. Something raw, more passionate, more working class. Mill workers and factory hands who've been playing football on patches of waste ground and public parks for years are forming clubs, not ad hoc groups of friends, but proper clubs, with committees and subscriptions, and a genuine sense of community identity. In Blackburn, clubs are forming around the cotton mills. In Sheffield, around the steelworks. In Darwen, in Burnley, in Preston, in Bolton. The same story over and over. These clubs are becoming serious. They're beginning to attract better players by the simple expedient of paying them, quietly, discreetly, through arrangements that everyone knows about and nobody discusses openly. They have fanatical local support. Thousands of working-class men whose lives are defined by mill shifts and Sunday chapel, who find in their local football club an expression of community, of local pride, of identity. When Blackburn plays Burnley, it isn't just a game. It's everything. The Southern clubs still dominate the Cup in 1877, but the clock is ticking. The 1876-77 final itself, Wanderers 2, Oxford University 1, was apparently a remarkably good game. Contemporary reports describe end-to-end action, chances at both ends, the lead changing, drama right to the final whistle. Oxford took the lead, Wanderers equalised, and then scored a winner late on. Kinnaird was described as ubiquitous, which seems to have been the standard description for him in almost every match he played. He was everywhere, defending when his side had the ball, attacking when they didn't, covering ground with an energy that seemed almost unfair in a man who was also finding time to run a bank and sit on the FA committee. After the final there was something of a scene. Oxford felt they deserved a draw at least, and there were murmurs about the officiating. This is another constant in the FA Cup's history. The losing side always feels hard done by. What's remarkable is how quickly the arguments of 1877 have faded and how the result alone endures. That's the Cup's great leveller. No matter how aggrieved you felt on the day, the record books don't care. Wanderers 2, Oxford University 1. The Cup goes to Wanderers, and that is all that matters. A crowd of 3,000 were at Kennington Oval to see the final. The 7th FA Cup, season 1877-78, Wanderers won it again. 5 times out of 7. 5 times. It's a record of dominance that has never been equalled by a club in the early years of their competition's existence, and probably never will be. They beat Royal Engineers 3-1 in what turned out to be a rather one-sided final. Their key players by this point included William Lindsay, Hubert Heron, and of course the indefatigable Kinnaird. After this 5th win, something remarkable happened. The Wanderers were offered the trophy outright. There was a tradition that if a club won the Cup 3 times in a row, or 5 times overall, they could keep the trophy permanently. And having won it 5 times in 7 years, with 3 consecutive wins in the middle of that run, Wanderers were entitled to it. They said no. In a gesture of tremendous sporting generosity, and perhaps an awareness that a trophy kept in perpetuity by one club would undermine the whole point of having a competition, Wanderers handed the Cup back to the FA. But they did so on one condition, that it was never given to any club permanently, that it would always belong to the competition itself, not to any winner. That condition stands to this day. When you see a modern Cup-winning captain lift the FA Cup above his head, he's holding a trophy that exists in its current form because a nomadic Victorian football club made a principled stand about sporting integrity. One more thing about the 7th Cup and the Wanderers dynasty before we close the book on them. They were never as dominant in the competition's rounds as their final appearances suggest. They benefited enormously, in the first few years, from the bye given to holders. In their consecutive wins from 1876 to 1878, they had to play very few matches before reaching the final. Sometimes as few as 2 or 3. Other clubs had to battle through 6 or 7 rounds. They were competing under rules designed partly to protect them. This isn't to diminish their achievement. They still had to win the games they played, and they did so convincingly, but it does contextualize the record. By the time the rules changed and the holders' bye was abolished, Wanderers' best days were behind them. They couldn't compete in an era where you had to earn every result from the first round onwards. Their kind of football, the ad hoc genius of talented amateurs, worked brilliantly in a limited competition. It was less well suited to the grind of a full knockout tournament against increasingly serious professional opposition. This was also the last of Wanderers' great era. A club with no fixed home, no local community to draw on, no resources beyond the willingness of its gentlemen players to turn up, was ill-equipped to survive what was coming. Wanderers' 5 wins are one of those facts that gets more remarkable the more you think about it. 5 wins out of 7 years of trying, in a competition they helped to create, against opposition that included military officers, university graduates, and public school old boys, essentially everyone who played football at the highest level in England. And they did it without any of the infrastructure we now consider essential. No ground, no training facilities, no professional coaching. Just a group of talented men who loved the game and were very good at it. The 1878 final against Royal Engineers was the Engineers' 4th final in 7 years. They'd won one and lost three. It was becoming something of a running joke in the football world. The Engineers would always be there, would always be good, would always come close, and would always fall short. The 3-1 defeat in this final was their most comprehensive loss, and after it, the Engineers gradually faded from cup contention. The club exists today, but its days of FA Cup glory were behind it. Final score: Wanderers 3, Royal Engineers 1. Kennington Oval welcomed 4,500 spectators for the occasion. As the 1870s ended then, we can draw up a brief report card on the Cup's first 7 years. On the positive side, the competition had established itself, was growing in entries and attendance, was generating sporting drama, and had produced some memorable finals and famous players. On the negative side, it was still dominated by a narrow social elite, geographically concentrated in London and the South, and had not yet penetrated the industrial North where football was developing its most passionate following. All of that was about to change with startling speed. The transition 1878 to 1883, now we enter what I think of as the transition period. The years when the old order, the London clubs, the public school alumni, the gentlemanly amateurs, faces its first serious challenge from the North. This is where the story becomes gripping. Because what happens in these 5 years isn't just a shift in which clubs win a cup competition. It's a class revolution played out on football pitches across England, Scotland and Wales. Let me paint you a picture of England in 1878. Victoria is Queen, Disraeli is Prime Minister. The British Empire is at the height of its power. Socially, the country is rigidly hierarchical, not in a legal sense, but in a deeply felt, deeply lived sense. There are those who were born into privilege, educated at the right schools, initiated into the networks of power, and there is everyone else. And everyone else, in 1878, is beginning to find their voice. The trade union movement is growing. Mass literacy is expanding, working men are beginning to organize politically, and in the mill towns and factory cities of northern England, they're organizing around football clubs with a ferocity and dedication that the southern gentlemen who invented the FA Cup never anticipated. The southern clubs still win the cup in this period, but it gets closer and closer and closer. Something else is happening in this period that deserves mention. The football press is growing up. The sporting papers that covered the early cups had done so in a fairly perfunctory way. Brief match reports, some comments on the play, a few names mentioned. By the late 1870s, coverage is expanding dramatically. More papers are carrying football reports. The language is becoming richer and more precise. Readers are following the cup not just as a local story but as a national narrative, with heroes and villains, triumphs and reversals. This matters because the press creates the sense of the FA Cup as a continuous story, not just isolated matches, but a competition with a beginning, a middle and an end, with characters who persist from week to week and year to year. When Arthur Kinnaird appeared in yet another final, readers who'd followed him for a decade knew who he was, what he'd done, what he represented. The press was building the mythology of the cup, even as the cup itself was building. The Telegraph, meanwhile, was transforming the speed at which results could travel. In the early 1870s, news of a cup result might take days to reach distant parts of the country. By the late 1870s, the Telegraph network was comprehensive enough that results could appear in London's evening papers on the same day as the match. This meant that a club in Sheffield could play on a Saturday afternoon and have the result reported in London, Manchester and Birmingham before nightfall. Football was becoming, for the first time, truly national news. Before we look at the individual cups of this transition era, let me introduce you to the concept of the Scottish footballer in England, because it's absolutely central to understanding what happens in the late 1870s and early 1880s. Scotland had developed football differently from England. While England's public school tradition emphasized individual dribbling, the best man takes the ball and runs with it. Scotland's clubs, particularly Queen's Park and the clubs influenced by them, had developed the passing game. Intricate, coordinated, intelligent, pass, move, create space, pass again. It was simply more effective. And Scottish players who had grown up playing this way found, when they came south, that they were frequently better than the English players they were competing against. And come south they did, in substantial numbers from the late 1870s onwards. The northern mill towns offered them work, officially, and under the counter payments to play football, unofficially. Men like Fergie Souter at Darwen, and later many others at Blackburn, Preston, and the other great Lancashire clubs, were the vanguard of a Scottish football diaspora that would completely reshape English football. They brought the passing game with them, they brought professionalism in practice if not in name, and they brought a ruthless desire to win that the more recreational southern clubs sometimes lacked. This is the hidden story of the transition period. Underneath the surface narrative of northern clubs challenging southern clubs, there's a quieter story about Scottish players transforming English football. The 8th FA Cup, 1878-79. Old Etonians won the cup for the first time, beating Clapham Rovers 1-0 in the final. The winning goal was scored by C.J. Clerk in what was reported as a scrappy physical final, not the most elegant football either side had produced. But winning isn't always about elegance. The final isn't really the story of 1879, though. The story of 1879 is Nottingham Forest. Nottingham Forest, a name that will need very little introduction to anyone who knows their football, though what most people know about Forest relates to Brian Clough and the late 1970s rather than the late 1870s. But here, in the 1879 FA Cup, for the first time we have a club from the Midlands making a serious, sustained run. Forest reached the semi-finals, which was extraordinary for a club from outside the London area. They lost to Old Etonians, the eventual winners, but they'd made their mark. They'd shown that a club from the provinces could compete at the highest level of the competition. It mattered enormously. It sent a message to clubs across the North and Midlands: you belong here. Forest themselves are worth a small digression, because they're one of the oldest clubs in the world, founded in 1865. They're credited with a number of significant footballing innovations, among the first clubs to use a referee's whistle, among the first to use shin pads, and there's a claim, disputed, colourfully, that they introduced football to Brazil in the early 20th century. Old Etonians winning meant something. It meant the aristocracy could still compete. It meant that Eton's old boys, with their networks and their privilege and their athletic tradition, still had a place at the top table of English football. For now. Arthur Kinnaird played in this final, of course. His 8th cup appearance. He was now in his early 30s, a successful businessman and banker, a man with substantial responsibilities who somehow continued to find the time and the energy to play football at the highest level. His commitment to Old Etonians was absolute. He trained seriously by the standards of the era. He cared about winning in a way that some of his more recreational teammates perhaps did not, and he carried the team in this final, his drive and energy compensating for what Old Etonians lacked in tactical sophistication compared to some of the northern sides now appearing on the scene. Clapham Rovers, the losing finalists, are worth a moment of sympathy. They'd played good football throughout the competition, had been competitive in the final, and came within an inch of winning it. Their subsequent decline was fairly rapid. They folded briefly in the early 1880s and faded from football's landscape entirely. They're a footnote now. But in 1879 they were one of the better football clubs in England. The Cup's history is full of such clubs, brilliant briefly, then gone, replaced by the forces of commercialization and professionalism that neither they nor anyone else entirely foresaw. Final score: Old Etonians 1, Clapham Rovers 0. 5,000 people were in attendance at Kennington Oval to see the Etonians edge it. The 9th FA Cup, season 1879-80. Clapham Rovers got their revenge on everyone who'd ever overlooked them. They beat Oxford University 1-0 in the final to claim the cup. A proper London club beating a university side. It seemed like a natural order of things, a reasonable settling of accounts. But again, the margins of this competition are where the real story lies. Sheffield, now finally engaging seriously with the FA and its cup, were fielding competitive teams. Nottingham clubs were developing. The game was spreading, and spreading fast, and not just geographically. It was spreading socially. The men entering these clubs were beginning to look different from the Wanderers and Oxford University old boys of the early years. The attendance at the final was growing too, around 6,000 people at the Oval now. 3 times what it had been 8 years earlier. Word was getting out. But here's the key thing happening in 1880 that the scoreboard doesn't show you, Darwen FC. A small Lancashire club from a small Lancashire town, between Blackburn and Bolton, population about 30,000, cotton mills, terrace streets, and Darwen, in the 1879-80 competition, caused a sensation by holding the mighty Old Etonians to 2 draws before losing the third replay. Let me tell you why that matters. Darwen had started paying players. Not openly, that would have been scandalous, but effectively, and some of their players were Scots, including Fergie Souter and James Love, brought down to Lancashire to work in the local mills and not coincidentally to play football. Holding Old Etonians to 2 draws was a footballing earthquake. The working-class game was announcing itself. The papers covered it extensively. People were scandalized in some quarters, delighted in others. The Darwen saga, which technically happened in 1879-80, preceding this cup rather than being part of it, but which set the tone for everything that followed, is one of the great underreported stories of football history. Their first replay against Old Etonians ended in another draw, so they came back a third time. And this time, Old Etonians won. But the effort of playing 3 full matches against these northern upstarts had visibly shaken the southern establishment. Who were these people? Where had they come from? And why were they so good? The answer, if anyone had looked closely, was obvious. Darwen were paying their players. Fergie Souter, their Scottish winger, and one of the best players in England, was officially employed at the local mill. In practice, he trained every day and played football on Saturdays. His wage from the mill was considerably more generous than his actual output justified. Everyone knew this. Nobody said it openly. The fiction of amateurism was maintained, because the alternative, acknowledging that working-class men deserved to be paid for entertaining thousands of paying spectators, was too radical for the FA's establishment to contemplate. But the cracks were showing, and in the next few years, those cracks would become chasms. For Clapham Rovers, their 1880 Cup win was the peak. They beat Oxford University 1-0 in the final through a goal from Lloyd Jones, and celebrated what would turn out to be the greatest moment in their club's history. Within a few years they'd be gone, swallowed by the professionalization of the game that was rendering their kind of club, upper middle class, London, amateur, increasingly irrelevant. Final score: Clapham Rovers 1, Oxford University 0. A crowd of 6,000 made their way again to Kennington Oval to take in the occasion. The 10th FA Cup, season 1880-81. This is the year in which everything starts to change. Old Carthusians, old boys of Charterhouse School, another of the great public schools, won the cup, beating Old Etonians 3-0 in the final, an all-public school final. On the surface, the old order is intact, but the margin of the victory tells a different story. Old Carthusians were an exceptional team. They had several players who were among the best in England regardless of social class, and the 3-0 win was a dominant performance. What makes this cup interesting, though, isn't the final. It's the journey to the final, and the clubs that came close. Darwen again made a run. Blackburn Rovers, whom we'll be hearing a great deal more about very shortly, made a run. These clubs didn't just enter the competition and lose in the early rounds. They progressed. They beat people. They showed they could compete. Old Carthusians' win also tells us something interesting about the internal dynamics of the old guard. The public school clubs weren't a monolith. Eton and Charterhouse were rivals in the old school sense, and when Old Carthusians hammered Old Etonians, there was doubtless a certain satisfaction on the Charterhouse side that had nothing to do with football. By this point, clubs like Darwen, Blackburn, and a dozen others were becoming forces. The southern clubs still won it in 1881, but the northern clubs were right there, breathing down their collective necks. Old Carthusians deserve a proper moment of appreciation. They were, objectively, an excellent football team. Their forward line was outstanding. Stanley Mosforth was described by contemporaries as the finest dribbler in England, a player of extraordinary individual skill who could take on and beat any defender of the era. William Page was a powerful and creative centre-forward, and their team organisation, while not yet matching the sophistication of the best northern clubs, was considerably better than the simple individualism of some of their southern contemporaries. Their 3-0 win over Old Etonians in the final was an utter demolition. 3 goals in a cup final in 1881 was a comprehensive victory. Old Etonians had Kinnaird, as always, But they didn't have enough around him. The Carthusians' cohesion as a team was simply too much. What's interesting about Old Carthusians is that, unlike Wanderers and Old Etonians, they seemed willing to engage with the changing world of football. Some of their players had begun training more seriously. They thought about their tactics. They were, in a sense, the amateur club's answer to the Northern Challenge, trying to match the professionalism in everything but payment. It wasn't quite enough, as it turned out, but they gave it their best shot. Final score: Old Carthusians 3, Old Etonians 0. A crowd of 4,000 were at Kennington Oval to see the Carthusians put on a show. The 11th FA Cup, season 1881 to 82. Old Etonians again. Their second and final cup triumph, and this one was dramatic. They beat Blackburn Rovers 1-0, holding on against a northern club that had come south with every intention of taking the trophy back with them. Old Etonians beating Blackburn Rovers. Think about what that contest represents. On one side, the establishment, the aristocracy, men who'd grown up playing football at Eton before going to Cambridge or straight into the army or the city. On the other side, Blackburn Rovers, working class, northern, effectively professional in all but name, men who played football not for recreation but because they were, in practice if not in law, paid to do so. They hadn't won. The Old Guard had held on just barely by 1 goal, but it was close. It was very, very close. The goal that won it was scored by P. Anderson. Blackburn were furious after the match. They felt, with some justification, that they'd been the better side for long stretches of the game, and they were probably right. But right didn't matter on the day. This was the last time an amateur, southern, public school-dominated club would win the FA Cup. Let me say that again, because it deserves emphasis. This was the last time. After Old Etonians in 1882, no amateur southern club would ever win the FA Cup again. The Etonians were the last of their kind to lift the trophy. They didn't know it at the time, of course. They celebrated their victory with the usual Victorian restraint, and then went back to their estates and their very comfortable lives. But football was about to be taken away from them. Football belonged to the North now. The 1881-82 final is one of those matches that crystallizes a historical moment with almost suspicious neatness. Old Etonians versus Blackburn Rovers, the aristocracy versus the workers, the past versus the future. And for one last afternoon, the past won. Lord Kinnaird played his 9th and final cup final in this match. 9 finals. He'd won 5 of them. He'd been on the losing side 4 times. His career in the FA Cup spanned the entire first decade of the competition's existence, from the muddy beginnings of 1872 to this last gasp of the old order in 1882. When the final whistle blew and Old Etonians had held on for their 1-0 victory, Kinnaird must have known, somewhere in that brilliant sporting mind of his, that this was the end of an era. The northern clubs were simply too good now, too organised, too determined. They would not be kept out much longer. Blackburn Rovers in 1882 were already one of the finest clubs in England. Their goalkeeper James Arthur was excellent. Their forwards, including men like Jim Brown and Douglas, were technically accomplished and physically formidable. They'd come to London wanting to win, not just to take part. And they'd been good enough to win on the day, just not quite lucky enough. 1 goal, 1 deflection, 1 missed chance. That's a cup final. That's always been a cup final. The old establishment celebrated. The FA's amateur grandees raised their glasses. But the writing was on the wall, and everyone could read it. Final score: Old Etonians 1, Blackburn Rovers 0. A crowd of 6,500 packed into Kennington Oval to see the Old Guard hold on. The 12th FA Cup, season 1882-83, the Revolution Blackburn Olympic beat Old Etonians 2-1 in the final, and with that result, the entire social order of English football was upended. Not tweaked, not nudged, upended. Blackburn Olympic were working class, entirely working class. Weavers, plumbers, cotton spinners, a dental assistant, not gentlemen, not public schoolboys, men who worked with their hands and played football with their feet, and had no interest whatsoever in the genteel tradition of amateur sport. They looked different from the Old Etonians. They spoke differently. They came from a different world entirely. And on the March 31st, 1883, At the Kennington Oval, they were better. Their captain, Jack Hunter, had organised a proper pre-match training camp for the final, taking the team to Blackpool for a week of preparation. This was almost unheard of at the time. The idea that a football team needed dedicated preparation, needed to work on their fitness and their tactics and their cohesion away from the distractions of ordinary life, was not how the gentlemen amateurs thought about football at all. You just turned up and played. You were a sportsman, and sportsmen didn't need to train like labourers. Olympics Blackpool camp was a professionalised approach in everything but name, and it worked. The final went to extra time, the first FA Cup final in history to require extra time. For 90 minutes the teams were level, a tense and physical contest. And in that extra time, Jimmy Costley scored the winning goal for Olympic, sending the Lancashire contingent in the crowd into ecstasy. Old Etonian's captain, that remarkable Lord Kinnaird, playing in his 9th and final cup final, shook hands graciously and reportedly said that he hoped the cup would always remain in Blackburn. Whether he meant it is another question, but there was a dignity in defeat there, a recognition that the game had changed and that the change was, perhaps, right. The trophy went north, and it would not come back south for a very, very long time. The 1882-83 final, Blackburn Olympics' great victory, also had a fascinating subplot that the history books tend to glide over, the question of what constitutes amateurism when one side is clearly better prepared than the other. Olympics Blackpool training camp, their organised coaching, their attention to fitness, none of these things required direct payment to players to be considered a professionalised approach. They were simply doing things that the amateur code hadn't thought to prohibit, because those things hadn't existed before. Old Etonians, arriving at the Oval in their usual state of gentlemanly preparation, some practice matches, general fitness, the assumption that natural ability and character would carry the day, were out-prepared before a ball was kicked. The gap in physical condition between the two sides was noticeable to contemporary observers. Olympic were fitter, sharper, more consistent over 90 minutes and beyond. This is what systematic preparation produces, and it doesn't require formal professionalism to achieve it. The significance of Blackburn Olympics' victory in 1883 cannot be overstated. This wasn't merely a football result. It was a statement about who owned English culture now, or rather, who was claiming it. The working class of northern England, who had been told throughout their lives that sport was for gentlemen, that competition at the highest level was the preserve of the educated and the leisured, had gone to London and beaten the gentlemen at their own game. The players in Olympics' team worked during the week, worked in the cotton mills and workshops of Blackburn. Thomas Dewhurst was a spinner, James Nuttall was a cotton operative, John Yates was a plumber, Albert Warburton was a weaver. These men spent their weeks doing physical labour and their weekends playing football. They had no access to decent training, facilities by modern standards. Their diet was the diet of working-class Lancashire in the 1880s, which was not, shall we say, optimally designed for peak athletic performance. And yet they were the best football team in England. It is worth also noting that Blackburn Olympic were not the only great Blackburn club of this era. Blackburn Rovers, a different club entirely, had been building toward their own period of dominance. Olympic and Rovers were rivals within the town, representing different communities, different works, different streets. The fact that one Lancashire cotton town could produce two cup-caliber clubs simultaneously tells you something powerful about the depth of football culture that had developed in the north. Olympic themselves would not repeat their triumph. They struggled financially in subsequent years. The working-class model of football was precarious, without the gate receipts that a successful, established club could generate. By the late 1880s they had folded. But their one-cup win endures. The little lads from the spinning rooms of Blackburn took the cup from the lords and the officers of the old establishment and carried it home on the train. The world was never quite the same again. Final score, Blackburn Olympic 2 Old Etonians won after extra time. 8,000 supporters filled Kennington Oval to witness one of the great upsets of the early cup. The Blackburn years. and the birth of professionalism, 1883 to 88. What happens next is remarkable, because it's not just one northern club that dominates, it's one northern town. Blackburn, Lancashire, a cotton town. Population at this point maybe 100,000 people. Smokestacks and terrace streets and the constant rhythmic thunder of the looms. And from this one town, in the space of 5 years, come 3 different FA Cup winning clubs. But before we get into the individual cups, let me tell you about the professionalisation crisis, because this is the backdrop to everything that happens in this period, and you cannot understand the FA Cup of the 1880s without it. By 1883, it was an open secret that clubs in the north were paying their players, not as a formal salary, not openly acknowledged, but effectively. The FA knew it, the public knew it, the clubs knew it, everyone knew it, and the FA's amateur establishment was in a state of absolute fury about it, partly because it violated their principles, and partly because it was beating them on the football pitch. The mechanism was simple and almost impossible to stop. A Scottish player of quality would be approached by a northern club. He'd be offered a job, in a cotton mill, in a factory, and the job would be real in the sense that he'd turn up and be on the payroll. But the hours would be flexible, the pay would be generous, and everyone understood that the real reason he was there was to play football. The term charmateur was coined to describe this arrangement. Consider the specific case of Fergie Souter, who played for Darwen and then for Blackburn Rovers. Souter was a stonemason from Glasgow, an accomplished footballer who had helped Queen's Park develop their passing style. When he came south to Darwen in the late 1870s, he was officially employed as a stonemason. In practice, he trained with the club, played every match, and was paid generously. When Blackburn Rovers, who had more money and ambition than Darwen, came calling with an even better offer, he moved to them. He was a professional footballer, openly living as one, in everything but the legal definition. When the FA investigated Darwen, they found evidence of payments, but couldn't definitively prove them in a way that would survive legal challenge. So the evidence was noted, warnings were issued, and nothing fundamentally changed. The charmateur system continued for another 5 years. Souter's case illustrates something important. The players who drove professionalization were not cynics or mercenaries. They were skilled men who had a marketable talent and wanted reasonably to be compensated for it. A stonemason was paid for his skill with stone. Why shouldn't a footballer be paid for his skill with a ball? The logic was impeccable. The only argument against it was the amateur code, which was essentially the argument that sport must be kept for those with independent means. In a country where most people had no independent means, this was not a compelling argument. The FA launched investigations. Clubs were suspended, players were expelled, and none of it made the slightest difference, because the economic logic was irresistible. A working man simply could not take time off work to travel to away games and train every day without some form of compensation. The alternative, restricting football to men who had independent means, would have killed the Northern game stone dead. The crisis came to a head in 1884 and 1885 when Accrington and Preston North End were accused of fielding professional players. Preston's William Siddell essentially dared the FA to do its worst. He told them, more or less openly, that Preston had professional players, that this was how football worked in Lancashire, and that if the FA tried to expel them, then the northern clubs would form their own rival British Football Association. And faced with that threat, the threat of a schism, the FA blinked. In July 1885, the Football Association legalized professionalism. It was one of the most consequential decisions in the history of English football. Once professionalism was legal, the game could develop properly. Clubs could invest, players could commit fully, standards improved dramatically. The Football League, which would follow in 1888, grew directly from this moment. All of which means that the FA Cup of the 1880s isn't just a football competition. It laid the foundations of the world's greatest sport. The professionalization crisis also tells us something interesting about the limits of well-intentioned rules in the face of powerful economic incentives. The FA's amateur rule wasn't hypocritical in origin. The men who made it believed that payment corrupted sport, that the purity of competition required participants who played for its own sake rather than for money. It was a coherent philosophy, and not a stupid one. The concern that professional football would become subject to corruption, to match fixing, to commercial pressures that would distort the game, These were legitimate worries. Some of them turned out to be prescient, but the rules simply couldn't hold against the economic reality of working-class sport. A man who works in a mill cannot also train full-time and travel to away games at his own expense. The choice was stark. Either football remained an exclusively middle and upper-class sport, or it accepted professionalism. And football, mercifully, chose to expand. The clubs from Lancashire, who dominate the next 5 years, represent professionalism at its early best, energetic, locally rooted, generating community pride, and raising the technical standard of the game dramatically. There's one more thing worth saying about the professionalisation debate before we leave it behind. The FA's eventual decision to legalise professionalism in 1885 was not universally welcomed even among the northern clubs. Some players and club officials had become genuinely comfortable with the chamateur system. The money was flowing, nobody was prosecuted, and the amateur status gave a certain respectability. Legalization meant transparency, and transparency meant accountability. You had to report what you were paying. You had to register your professionals. The flexibility of the grey area was replaced by the rigidity of the rulebook. But in the long run, of course, it was unambiguously the right decision. Legal professionalism allowed clubs to plan properly. It allowed players to negotiate proper contracts. It allowed agents, rudimentary, informal, but real, to begin operating. It created the conditions for the Football League, which required professional clubs willing to commit to a full season's fixtures. Everything that followed in English football flows, in some way, from the decision made at the FA's committee meeting in 1885. The 13th FA Cup, season 1883-84, Blackburn Rovers, the first of their 3 consecutive cups. They beat Queen's Park of Glasgow 2-1 in the final at the Kennington Oval, and with that victory the northern clubs announced definitively that they were here to stay. Queen's Park, the Scots are back, and they're still brilliant. Queen's Park were at this point one of the finest clubs in Britain. Their passing game was beautiful, their organisation superb, their discipline exemplary. They were also still entirely amateur, which is fascinating given everything happening around them. Queen's Park maintained their amateur status right through the professional era and deep into the modern era, only turning professional in 2019. They're still active in the lower divisions of the Scottish Football League today, which makes them one of the most extraordinary survivals in the entire history of the sport. Their journey to the 1884 final was impressive. They'd beaten several decent English sides on the way, and they came to London with huge confidence. For periods of the final, they looked like they might win it. But on this day, Blackburn Rovers were better. Their key players included James Brown, the goalkeeper, one of the finest of his era, Jimmy Douglas and Joseph Sauberts in attack. Working men, all. Men who played football because they were good at it and were effectively paid to be good at it, and who brought to the game a hunger and commitment that the amateur tradition struggled to match. The final was attended by about 4,000 people at the Oval, a relatively small crowd, but these were people who'd read about the competition in the papers, who knew the names, who cared about the result. Queen's Park's failure to win here is one of the great near misses of the early competition. They were excellent. They just faced a more excellent opponent. The 1883-84 competition also saw something significant happen in the earlier rounds, the debut of clubs from the northeast. Sunderland entered for the first time. They went out early, but their appearance was a marker of the game's geographic spread. From London and the home counties in 1871, to Lancashire and the Midlands in the late 1870s, and now to County Durham and the North East in 1884. Football was completing its conquest of industrial England. The North East would produce some of the greatest clubs and players in the history of the game. Sunderland would be league champions multiple times in the 1890s. Newcastle would be a powerhouse in the Edwardian era. The working men of the collieries and shipyards of the Tyne, the Wear, and the Tees took to football with the same passionate intensity as their counterparts in the cotton towns of Lancashire. But that story is for another day. For now, note the entry of the Mackems and file it away. Blackburn Rovers' 2-1 win over Queen's Park in this final was thoroughly deserved. What made Rovers special in this era was not just individual quality but collective organisation. They pressed high when they didn't have the ball, unusual for the era when most clubs still had their players standing in position waiting for the ball to come to them. They moved the ball quickly. They worked for each other. It was, by the standards of 1884, tactically advanced football. What's remarkable about Blackburn Rovers of this season is that their tactical innovation emerged not from any single brilliant coach or theorist, but organically from the players themselves. Men who had played together, understood each other's movements, developed instinctive responses to different game situations. This kind of organic tactical development is actually more durable than systems imposed from above by a manager, because the players own it, believe in it, and execute it even under pressure. When things went wrong in a match, Rovers could problem-solve collectively rather than waiting for instructions. This is the essence of a great team, and it's something that can't be manufactured in a short time. Final score: Blackburn Rovers 2, Queen's Park 1. Around 4,000 were at Kennington Oval to see a second Blackburn team take the honours. The 14th FA Cup, season 1884-85. Blackburn Rovers win 2-0 against Queen's Park in the final. The same two clubs meeting for the second consecutive year. Queen's Park back for another go, and again falling short, and this time more convincingly. The 2-0 scoreline is flattering to Queen's Park. For long stretches, Rovers were superior. This was also the year that the professionalism debate was reaching its absolute peak. The investigations, the suspensions, the threats, the counter-threats, it was all playing out in the newspapers and the committee rooms while the actual football continued on the pitches. Playing out against this backdrop, Blackburn Rovers were the most visible symbol of what the new professional North looked like: organised, powerful, properly funded, absolutely serious. Their goalkeeper, Herbie Arthur, was considered one of the very best in England. The goalkeeper's role was still developing. The rules about what keepers could do were being refined throughout this period. But Arthur had mastered the position in its current form. He commanded his area, distributed the ball intelligently, and was virtually unbeatable on his best days. They were a proper football club, not a collection of gentlemen who happened to enjoy kicking a ball around. Queen's Park's failure to win either of these two finals is one of the great what-ifs of football history. If they'd won one, if they'd taken the cup back to Glasgow, would Scottish clubs have continued to enter the English Cup? Would the histories of English and Scottish football look completely different? Would we have had a British League by the 1890s? We'll never know. As it was, Queen's Park entered the competition a couple more times, but never again reached the final, and the FA Cup gradually became an exclusively English affair. Scotland had its own cup competition by now. The Scottish FA Cup had been running since 1874, and Scottish clubs increasingly focused their competitive energies on that and on the Scottish League. The great Scottish clubs of the late Victorian era, Celtic, Rangers, Heart of Midlothian, Hibernian, had no particular interest in travelling south to compete in the English Cup when they had a perfectly good competition of their own. And the English FA, for various political reasons, was not displeased by this development. The two football associations maintained a frosty, occasionally antagonistic relationship throughout this period. The 1884-85 Cup also saw Preston North End make a serious run for the first time. They were knocked out before the final, but they gave Rovers a serious game in the semi-finals. Under William Soudell's direction, Preston were becoming something extraordinary. Their squad was deepening, their tactics were sophisticating, their fitness was improving. The Lilywhites were coming. Herbie Arthur, Rovers' magnificent goalkeeper in this final, saved Blackburn many timid in the match. Queen's Park perhaps deserved more. 2-0 to Rovers. A crowd of 12,500 turned up at Kennington Oval to watch Rovers retain their grip on the trophy. The 15th FA Cup, season 1885-86. Blackburn Rovers won it again, the second team to win 3 consecutive FA Cups. They beat West Bromwich Albion 2-0 in the replay after a goalless final. West Bromwich Albion. Another name you know, the Baggies, the Throstles. Another Midlands club making their mark. The geography of football is expanding year by year. It's not just London versus Lancashire now. The Midlands are coming too. Birmingham, West Bromwich, Aston Villa, all developing rapidly, all spending money on players, all building proper grounds, all accumulating support from local communities. The first match, at the Oval, finished 0-0, what was apparently a cautious tactical affair. Both sides seemed wary of each other. aware that losing a final was potentially catastrophic. The replay was held at the racecourse ground in Derby, one of the first finals not held at the Oval, a sign that the FA was beginning to think about neutrality and geography in a new way. Why should the final always be in London? Rovers won the replay fairly comfortably 2-0. Blackburn's third consecutive win was achieved, remarkably, with three somewhat different squads. The teams evolved year on year. James Forrest played in all three winning finals and deserves particular mention. He was one of the first Englishmen to be openly, unambiguously professional. He had no pretense of any other job. He was a professional footballer. In 1883, that would have been scandalous. By 1886, with professionalism recently legalized, it was merely the future. Forrest was a pointer to what football would become. James Forrest's career is, in microcosm, the story of the professionalization of football. He'd started out as a part-timer, a mill worker who played football at weekends. As Rovers' success grew, the demands on him grew too. More training, more games, more travel. At some point in the early 1880s, the fiction of the day job became impossible to maintain. He was a footballer. He was paid to be a footballer, and from 1885 he could admit it without risking expulsion. He was also technically outstanding, a winger of considerable pace and skill, capable of taking on defenders and delivering accurate crosses. In 3 cup final appearances, all 3 victorious, he was one of the best players on the pitch each time. For a man who played his football in the years before the game was properly documented, no newsreel footage, limited and often inaccurate newspaper descriptions, his achievements deserve to be better known. The 1885-86 replay at Derby was a significant event in itself. Derby, roughly equidistant between London and the northern heartlands, felt like a concession, a recognition that the Cup was no longer simply a London institution. The crowd of 12,000 for a midweek replay was substantial for the era and demonstrated that people would travel significant distances to watch the top 2 teams in England compete for the Cup. The FA was beginning to understand that it had created something of national importance. Final score, Blackburn Rovers 2, West Bromwich Albion 0 after a replay. The original match ended 0-0 in front of 15,000 at Kennington Oval, with 12,000 making the trip to the racecourse ground in Derby for the replay. The 16th FA Cup, season 1886-87, Aston Villa. The Midlands Giants finally announced themselves on the national stage in the most emphatic way possible. Villa beat West Bromwich Albion 2-0 in the final at the Kennington Oval, and the attendance figure tells its own story. Almost 16,000 people. Aston Villa's origin story is worth telling. They were founded in 1874 by members of the Villa Cross Wesleyan Chapel in Aston, Birmingham. 4 young men sitting in the back of a chapel, bored of the winter, decided to form a football club. From those humble, devout beginnings, Villa had grown into one of the most powerful clubs in England. Their ground at Perry Bar was one of the finest in the country. Their committee was ambitious and organised in a way that spoke of the new era of professional football. Their players in this final included Archie Hunter, Dennis Hodgetts and Albert Allen. Hunter, Villa's Scottish captain, was one of the most celebrated footballers of his era. He'd come south from Scotland in the early 1880s, part of that great wave of Scottish talent that transformed English football, and he'd made Villa his own. He had pace, skill, a wonderful natural footballing intelligence, and above all, a natural leadership quality that made Villa a coherent team rather than a collection of individuals. The West Brom supporters were developing what would become a familiar feeling, disappointment at Villa's hands. 2 finals in successive years, 2 defeats. They had a good team and they knew it. Their day would come. The Aston Villa of the late 1880s was becoming one of the most professionally organised clubs in England. Their committee was forward-thinking and ambitious. They were prepared to spend money on players in a way that some clubs found distasteful, but which proved entirely correct. Their ground at Perry Bar was being developed and improved. Their financial management was sound. They looked, in short, like a modern football club, because they were, by the standards of the era, precisely that. It's worth noting the religious origins of the club again, because they tell us something important. The Villa Cross Wesleyan Chapel connection means that Aston Villa started from a tradition of nonconformist Christianity, the chapel culture of Victorian working-class England. This tradition valued discipline, self-improvement, community, and the responsible use of leisure time. Football fitted neatly into this framework. Playing sport was good for you. Competing was noble. Winning honourably was virtuous. It was a philosophical framework well suited to building a serious football club. Dennis Hodgetts, who scored one of Villa's 2 goals in this final, would go on to win 6 England caps. He was a creative, technically accomplished inside forward, not the most physically imposing player, but intelligent and quick, with an instinct for the right pass. He was also, by all accounts, enormously popular with the Villa supporters, who appreciated his commitment and his skill in equal measure. Final score: Aston Villa 2, West Bromwich Albion 0. A crowd of 15,500 were at Kennington Oval to see Villa announce themselves on the national stage. The 17th FA Cup, season 1887-88. West Brom finally got their revenge on the footballing world. They beat Preston North End 2-1 in the final at the Oval, and if the result feels in retrospect like the last gasp of one era before a new superpower arrived, it was also a fine performance by a West Brom team that had been so close so many times. Preston North End. The Lilywhites. I need to say that name properly, because it fills me with a kind of reverence, because Preston were about to do something extraordinary, something that has never been repeated, something that stands, even now, as perhaps the most remarkable achievement in the history of English club football. But we're not quite there yet. First, they have to lose this one. In 1888, Preston lost the cup final 2-1. Their goal was scored by John Goodall, a centre-forward, a genius, technically accomplished, physically imposing, with a football intelligence that most of his contemporaries could only marvel at, William Soudel. If Preston North End are the great heroes of this part of the story, Soudel is the mastermind. A cotton mill manager, he had essentially devoted his life to building Preston into the dominant force in English football. He recruited players systematically, organized training, thought about tactics and systems in ways that most football people of the era hadn't begun to consider. He was, in some ways, the first modern football manager. The fact that he later went to prison for embezzling money from the cotton mill, using it apparently partly to fund his football club, adds a certain tragic complexity to his story. West Brom's 2-1 victory was an absorbing game. Bayliss scored for West Brom, as did Wilson. Goodall replied for Preston, but they couldn't find the equaliser. The important thing about this final is not the result. The important thing is what was coming next. Preston North End, in the season of 1887-88, were already the best team in England. Their league record was extraordinary even before the league existed. They played friendlies and FA Cup matches and whatever other competitive football was available, and they won almost all of it. The 2-1 defeat to West Brom in the cup final was essentially a blip, a bad day for a team that was building towards something historic. The crowd of 19,000 at this final was, at the time, the largest ever for a cup final. 19,000 people at the Oval. A cricket ground that was not designed for this purpose, with limited terracing and inadequate facilities by the standards even of 1888. People must have stood uncomfortably, craning to see, enduring the kind of crowd conditions that we would now find unacceptable. But they came. They came in their thousands because the FA Cup final was the most important sporting event in England, and they were not going to miss it. West Brom's triumph was thoroughly popular in the Midlands. They were a beloved club, rooted in their community, and their players were local heroes in a way that the more itinerant professional footballer of later eras often wasn't. When Bayliss and Wilson scored, and West Brom held on against the mighty Preston, the celebrations in West Bromwich that evening were apparently considerable. Final score: West Bromwich Albion 2, Preston North End 1. 19,000 supporters packed into Kennington Oval, the largest cup final crowd to that point. The Invincibles and the Football League era, 1888 to 1896. The Football League is founded. 12 clubs, mostly from Lancashire and the Midlands, agree to a regular league competition, home and away, points for wins and draws, a proper season-long table. William McGregor of Aston Villa was the driving force. He sent letters to the leading clubs proposing the idea and called the founding meeting at Anderton's Hotel in Fleet Street in March 1888. It changed everything. MacGregor's letter, sent to the 5 leading clubs in early 1888, is one of the great documents in football history. It reads, in part, every year it is becoming more and more difficult for football clubs to meet their friendly engagements and even to arrange friendly matches. I beg to tender the following suggestion as a means of getting over the difficulty that 10 or 12 of the most prominent clubs in England combine to arrange home and away fixtures each season, the said fixtures to be arranged at a friendly conference. It is a remarkably measured, business-like communication from a man proposing something revolutionary. He wasn't seeking glory. He was solving a logistics problem, and the solution he proposed would define English football for the next century and a half. The founding 12 clubs were Accrington, Aston Villa, Blackburn Rovers, Bolton Wanderers, Burnley, Derby County, Everton, Notts County, Preston North End, Stoke, West Bromwich Albion, and Wolverhampton Wanderers. Look at that list. Not one London club, not one southern club of any description. These are all Midlands and Northern clubs, the clubs that had come to dominate the FA Cup, the clubs that had emerged from the Industrial Revolution. London football, at this point, was a decade behind the North in terms of organisation and professional development. The clubs that would later come to dominate English football, Arsenal, Tottenham, Chelsea, were either not yet founded or were small amateur outfits with no pretension to national significance. Because now, suddenly, clubs had a primary competition, the league. You played 22 games over the season against the other 11 clubs. Your league position mattered, week by week, accumulating across months. It was a sustained test of quality over time rather than the cup's brutal lottery. The FA Cup became a secondary trophy in institutional terms, important, prestigious, beloved, but secondary. And the team that dominated everything in those first years was the club that had come so agonisingly close the year before. Before we get to Preston's extraordinary 1888-89 season, let me briefly explain what the founding of the Football League meant for the FA Cup, because the relationship between the two competitions is important and slightly complicated. The Cup had been the only national competition since 1871. It was everything, the whole of professional football's competitive season in a sense. Now suddenly it was one of 2 major competitions, and the league, with its 22 games over 6 months, was in many ways the more important test of a team's quality. Winning the league required sustained excellence over a long season against the best competition. Winning the Cup required a succession of good performances on specific days when luck, fitness and home advantage could play a significant part. For clubs like Preston, winning both in the same season, the double, would be the ultimate achievement. It would mean being consistently brilliant over 22 league games, and then also producing their best football on the specific cup days that mattered. The difficulty of this challenge is why the double was achieved so rarely in football's first century, and why Preston's achievement in 1888-89 retains its extraordinary lustre even today. The Football League also changed the finances of football dramatically. Gate receipts from 22 home league games, plus cup ties, gave clubs a sustainable revenue base that some of the early amateur clubs could only dream about. The crowd-pulling power of Aston Villa, Preston, Blackburn and Everton in these early league years was remarkable, regularly attracting 10,000 to 20,000 for home matches. Football was becoming a substantial industry. There's a fascinating class dimension to the Football League's founding that mirrors everything we've seen in the FA Cup's history. William MacGregor, the Aston Villa committee man who drove the league's creation, was a draper's assistant, a working man, not a gentleman. He had come to Birmingham from Scotland and built a life through commerce. His vision for the Football League was explicitly commercial. He wanted clubs to have guaranteed fixtures, reliable income, and the ability to plan for the future. It was the vision of a businessman, not a sportsman in the Victorian amateur sense. The FA's establishment regarded the Football League with deep suspicion when it was founded. Here were the professional clubs essentially self-organizing, creating their own competition, running their own affairs. The FA still controlled the Cup and the England team, but its grip on the day-to-day life of professional football was loosening. The power dynamics of English football were shifting in ways that would eventually produce the modern structure. Premier League, EFL, FA Cup as the romantic outsiders competition that we know today. The 18th FA Cup, Season 1888 to 89. Preston North End. The Old Invincibles. This isn't just an FA Cup story. This is one of the great stories in football history, full stop. One of those stories that becomes more extraordinary the more closely you examine it. In the 1888-89 season, Preston North End won the Football League without losing a game, unbeaten through the entire league season. 22 games, 15 wins, 4 draws, not defeated once. Only Arsenal equalled it more than a century after. Both remarkable achievements. Preston also won the FA Cup without conceding a single goal. Not one goal conceded in the entire cup campaign. The league title and the cup, achieved in the same season, in their most emphatic possible form. The double unbeaten. Preston won the Football League without losing a single match and won the FA Cup without conceding a single goal in the same season. Only Arsenal has ever threatened this record. In the Cup, Preston played through multiple rounds, faced serious opposition from clubs that wanted desperately to beat them, and kept a clean sheet every single time. Their goalkeeper, Dr. John Mills, an actual medical doctor, still unusual in a professional football club, was brilliant. But it wasn't just Mills. The defensive unit was extraordinary. Fullbacks Nick Ross and Robert Howarth were among the finest in England. The halfbacks provided a platform, and in front of them the forward line was devastating. John Goodall at centre-forward, supported by Fred Dewhurst and Jimmy Ross, the younger brother of Nick. These were among the absolute best players in England, playing together in a coherent system under Soudell's guidance. The cup final was against Wolverhampton Wanderers at the Oval on the 30th of March 1889. The crowd of around 22,000 was the biggest yet for a cup final, and they were rewarded with a performance from Preston that was, by the accounts of those present, rather breathtaking. Preston won 3-0, and the scoreline was no fluke. Wolves were a decent side. They'd beaten Blackburn Rovers on the way to the final, but against Preston they were outclassed in virtually every department. After the match, there is a story, possibly apocryphal but too good not to tell, that Preston's captain suggested the team be photographed with the trophy before the final had even been played, so confident were they of victory. Whether the story is true or not, it captures the swagger of this team perfectly. They knew what they were. They knew how good they were. The Invincibles. Let me give you a sense of just how good Preston were in that 1888-89 season, because the numbers alone don't quite capture it. In the Football League they scored 74 goals and conceded only 15 in 22 games. That's an average of more than 3 goals per game scored and fewer than 1 per game conceded. The next best defence in the league conceded 39. Preston conceded 15. They were in a different class. Their squad had been assembled with care over several years by Soudell. The goalkeeper was James Traynor, a Welshman of considerable ability. But he wasn't even the team's best goalkeeper. Dr. John Mills played in the Cup, while Traynor generally played in the league. That's how deep the squad was. They had 2 international quality goalkeepers. They had Nick Ross, a Scottish international fullback, alongside Robert Howarth, equally international and equally excellent. Their captain was the fullback Ross, whose leadership qualities and tactical understanding shaped the team's defensive organisation. And then the forward line. John Goodall was the centrepiece, a player who would have been outstanding in any era, combining physical presence with technical skill in a way that was very unusual for the 1880s. Fred Dewhurst, his partner, was fast and direct. Jimmy Ross, younger brother of Nick, was creative and energetic. Jack Gordon on the wing was a nightmare for defenders. They played together as if they'd been built for each other, which in a sense, through Soudell's careful assembly, they had. The cup run that season saw Preston beat Bootle, Grimsby Town, Birmingham St George's, West Bromwich Albion in the semi-final, and then Wolves in the final. Clean sheets throughout. If you were a Preston opponent in 1888-89, you were not having a good time. You were, in fact, having the worst possible time. William Soudell's later fate, embezzlement, prison, emigration to South Africa, casts a shadow over his achievements, but it shouldn't erase them. He built something extraordinary. The Invincibles were his creation as much as any players. The tragedy of his personal story doesn't diminish the glory of what he helped to make. It's worth asking why. Preston's achievement has never been equaled. The Invincible season, going through an entire campaign unbeaten, has come close a handful of times. Arsenal in 2003-04 went unbeaten through 38 Premier League games, a remarkable achievement in a longer season against stronger opposition, but they lost in the FA Cup. They were not invincible in every competition simultaneously. Preston were. Everything they entered, they won or drew, not a single defeat all season in any competition. It is, when you sit with it, absolutely astonishing. Part of the answer is the quality of the squad Soudel assembled. Part of it is the systemic organization that allowed every player to understand his role and execute it consistently. But part of it, and this is the part that's hardest to recreate, is the particular psychological state of a team that simply does not believe it can lose. Winning generates a confidence that makes further winning more likely, and Preston in 1888-89 had reached a state where they expected to win every match they played. Not hoped, expected. That psychological certainty, once established, is a formidable advantage. It meant they never panicked in tight matches. They never doubted the system when it was under pressure. They simply played their game and let the result follow. Final score? Preston North End, 3 Wolverhampton Wanderers 0. 22,000 were at Kennington Oval to watch the old Invincibles complete the first double. The 19th FA Cup, season 1889-90. Blackburn Rovers were back, a 4th cup win for them, and the return of the team that had defined the mid-1880s. In what would become a pattern of rotating northern dominance, the old champions stepped back into the light. They beat Sheffield Wednesday, another name you'll know well from the modern game, 6-1 in the final at the Kennington Oval. A hammering, an absolute hammering. Sheffield Wednesday, who had been developing into a genuinely significant club through the 1880s, was simply demolished. Wednesday's appearance in the final was itself significant. Sheffield, that great football city, the city that can claim Sheffield FC, founded in 1857, as the oldest football club in the world, finally had a major representative in the cup final showpiece. The city had been waiting a long time for this moment. And then they were taken apart 6-1, which is not quite the entrance onto the biggest stage that you'd hope for. Blackburn's key man in this final was William Townley, who scored a hat-trick, 3 goals, in a cup final. The first hat-trick in FA Cup final history. At a time when scoring any goal at this level was considered a major individual achievement, Townley managed 3. His name deserves to be better known for this achievement alone. The hat-trick in the cup final would only be matched twice in history, by Jimmy Logan in 1894, whom we'll come to shortly, and by the great Stan Mortensen in 1953's famous Matthews final. The margin of 6-1 remains one of the most one-sided cup finals in history, matched by a small handful of equally brutal results since, but still remarkable by any standard. Wednesday could have no complaints. They were simply not at the races on the day. William Townley's hat-trick in this final deserves a dedicated moment of appreciation. Hat-tricks in cup finals are extraordinarily rare. In the entire history of the competition, it has happened only 3 times. Townley was the first. In a match where the pressure is at its highest, where the occasion is the biggest of any player's career, where nerves and tension are at their most acute, Townley scored 3 times. He first scored early to put Rovers ahead. He scored again to make it 3, and then a third to complete the hat-trick. Each goal, apparently, was of high quality, not scrambled tap-ins but strikers' finishes. Townley was a Blackburn-born forward who had developed entirely within Rovers' system. He wasn't a Scottish import or a player brought in from elsewhere. He was a product of the local footballing culture, which tells you something about how much that culture had developed in the years since Darwin Scots had first demonstrated the possibilities of the passing game to Lancashire audiences. By 1890, Lancashire was producing homegrown talent of the highest quality. The imported Scottish game had been absorbed and was now being repeated locally. Sheffield Wednesday, to give them their due, had played well throughout the competition to reach this final. They'd beaten Notts County and Accrington on the way. They arrived at the Oval as genuine contenders, not also-rans. The 6-1 scoreline shocked everyone, including probably Blackburn themselves. Some days the football gods just look at one team and say, "Not today." Final score: Blackburn Rovers 6, Sheffield Wednesday 1. A crowd of 20,000 looked on at Kennington Oval as Rovers put on a demolition job. The 20th FA Cup, season 1890-91. Blackburn Rovers again. Their fifth and final cup win, and this one has a certain valedictory quality about it. The last hurrah of a dynasty, the final flourish of a club that had defined a decade. They beat Notts County 3-1 at the Oval. Notts County, the oldest professional football club in the world, formed in 1862 before the Football Association even existed, who to this day wear the distinctive black and white stripes that would later, in a wonderful piece of sporting serendipity, inspire Juventus. The story goes that some of Notts County's players visited Turin in the early 20th century, and the fledgling Juventus club was so taken with the black and white that they adopted it permanently. There's enough truth in it to be worth mentioning. Notts County making a cup final is another marker of how the game is spreading. It's not just Lancashire versus the Midlands anymore. It's specific clubs from specific cities, each with their own identity, their own community, their own reason for existing. Blackburn's 3-1 win completed one of the most extraordinary runs in cup history, 5 wins in 9 years, with 3 consecutive wins in the heart of that run. They were the team of the 1880s, no question. Their dominance shaped the decade. Their players became household names across England, but 1891 was the last of it. Blackburn would enter the competition in subsequent years, and they'd have decent cup runs, but never again would they lift the trophy. The era was over. New forces were emerging. Blackburn Rovers' 5 FA Cup wins between 1884 and 1891 represent one of the most concentrated periods of dominance in the competition's history. To win 5 times in 8 years, including 3 in a row, at a time when the competition was getting larger, more competitive, and more professionally contested with every passing season, is a remarkable achievement. What did Rovers have? They had a stable, well-organized committee that understood how to build and maintain a football club. They had an excellent scouting network, principally into Scotland, that allowed them to bring in quality players on a regular basis. They had a playing style that was ahead of its time, based on collective organization rather than individual dribbling. And they had the deep emotional investment of a whole town that saw them as its primary ambassador to the wider world. Blackburn in the 1880s was not a wealthy town by the standards of English industrial cities. It was a cotton town, dependent on the mills, subject to the cycles of boom and bust that afflicted the textile industry throughout the Victorian era. Football gave the town a way of competing on a national stage that its economic circumstances could not. When Blackburn Rovers won the cup, the town was briefly the most celebrated place in England. That meant something. It still means something. Before we leave the Blackburn years behind, I want to say something about what the Rovers' dominance meant to the town of Blackburn itself. In the 1880s, Blackburn was a town under pressure. The cotton industry was facing increasing competition from Asian manufacturers. Wages were stagnant, unemployment was a persistent threat, and the social conditions in the mill workers' terraces were grim by any standard. Football was not an escape from this. It was, in a sense, an expression of it. The energy, the passion, the competitiveness that went into Blackburn Rovers' cup campaigns came from the same source as the determination that made the cotton workers fight for better conditions and higher pay. When Rovers won the cup, not once, not twice, but 5 times, the town was briefly the most celebrated in England. The players were heroes on a scale that no Blackburn person had ever been heroes before. Local boys and imported Scots, who became local boys, playing football and winning for Blackburn against clubs from richer, more famous places. It meant something. It still means something to anyone who knows the history of that town. Notts County, the losing finalists in 1891, went back to Nottingham knowing they'd had the better of the first half but been overcome in the second. Their goalkeeper Toon had made several fine saves. Their forwards had created chances. But Rovers' experience in big matches showed in the second half, and the 3-1 scoreline reflected the course of the game fairly. Final score: Blackburn Rovers 3, Notts County 1. Some 23,000 supporters were at Kennington Oval to see Rovers claim their 5th and final cup, more than 10 times the crowd of the very first final just 20 years earlier, the 21st FA Cup. Season 1891-92. West Bromwich Albion won their second cup, again beating Aston Villa, this time 3-0 in the final, and again we have a Midlands derby in a cup final, the two great Birmingham area clubs facing off for the greatest prize in domestic football. This rivalry between West Brom and Villa is one of the defining stories of this era of the cup, and it's worth appreciating what it represents. Two clubs from the same conurbation, Birmingham being the centre and West Brom and Villa, both being communities within its orbit, competing at the highest level of the game. This kind of intense local rivalry, fueled by working-class community identity, class distinctions, even religious affiliation in some cases, was something entirely new to English sport. Cricket didn't produce it. Rugby didn't produce it. Only football, with its deep roots in specific working-class communities, could generate this kind of fierce, passionate local antagonism. Villa were beginning to build toward what would become their greatest era, the mid to late 1890s, when they would become perhaps the dominant force in English football. But in 1892, West Brom were the better side. Their forwards, Geddes, Nichols and Reynolds, were devastating. Villa's defence simply couldn't cope with them. The crowd was over 32,000 at the Oval. The cup final was now unambiguously the event of the sporting calendar. Nothing else in English sport commanded an audience like this. Cricket, which in the 1870s would have been considered the national sport beyond any argument, could not generate these crowds. Test match attendances were substantial but not consistent. Horse racing drew big crowds on specific race days, but was geographically dispersed and associated with gambling rather than community identity. Rugby, which was also professionalizing in the north during this period, the split that would produce rugby league was only 3 years away, had its own passionate following, but in a smaller geographic area and with a more limited class base than football. Football had become the national sport. Not officially, not yet. That would take more decades of growth than the First World War's role in spreading the game across the armed forces. But functionally, in terms of attendances, newspaper coverage, and the emotional investment of millions of English people, football in 1892 was already the dominant sport. The FA Cup was its showpiece. The West Brom and Villa rivalry by 1892 had become one of the defining narratives of the FA Cup's first 2 decades. They'd met in finals in 1887, Villa won, and would meet again in 1895. Each meeting carried the Midlands football identity. The supporters of both clubs turned up for these finals with an intensity that the FA had perhaps not anticipated when it set up a neutral venue final. This particular 3-0 final was notable for a remarkable performance by West Brom's Jem Bayliss, who scored twice and was later described in match reports as irresistible. He was a big physical centre-forward who played with tremendous confidence on the biggest stage. When you know you're going to win, when you feel it from the first minute, the game opens up in front of you. And West Brom felt it from the start. Villa, for their part, were going through something of a transitional period. Several of their key players from the 1887 triumph had retired or moved on, and the new generation hadn't quite established itself yet. The 3-0 defeat was a chastening experience that, in retrospect, served as fuel for their subsequent drive toward their greatest era. Sometimes the defeats that sting most are the ones that make champions. The Kennington Oval hosted its last FA Cup final this year. After 1892, the Cup final, the ground's capacity was simply insufficient for the crowds the Cup was now generating, and the FA needed a bigger venue. The Oval had served its purpose magnificently. It was the setting for 13 of the first 21 Cup finals, but its era was over. Football and cricket's shared infrastructure was about to separate. Final score: West Bromwich Albion 3, Aston Villa 0. A crowd of 32,810 descended on Kennington Oval for what would prove to be the last Cup final held at the famous ground. The 22nd FA Cup, season 1892-93. Wolverhampton Wanderers, their first Cup win. The Wolves. Wolves beat Everton 1-0 in a final that was moved to Fallowfield in Manchester, and this relocation is historically significant. It was the first Cup final not held in London, and it reflected a hard truth the FA could no longer ignore. You couldn't keep holding the final in London when most of the best teams, and most of the supporters who'd want to attend, were from the north. Fallowfield, a ground belonging to the Manchester Athletic Club, was chosen as a compromise, not quite northern, not southern, a middle ground in every sense. Everton, the losing finalists, were one of the most significant clubs in the early Football League. Founded in 1878, they'd won their first Football League title in 1890-91, and they were building the kind of sustained excellence that would make them one of English football's great institutions. Their defeat in this final was rather a blow. The crowd at Fallowfield was enormous. Estimates suggest around 45,000 people poured in. And it was chaotic. Fallowfield was simply not designed or equipped for crowds of this size, and the match was played in scenes of considerable disorder, with spectators spilling onto the touchlines and encroaching onto the pitch at various points. The FA would remember this experience when it came to choosing future venues. Wolves' winning goal was scored by Harry Allen, a Wolverhampton-born forward who'd been with the club since the mid-1880s. He had the composure in front of goal that decides tight cup finals. This final also crystallized the debate about the cup final venue that would preoccupy the FA for years. Where should it be played permanently? London? Manchester? Somewhere else entirely? The answer, for the time being, was nowhere in particular. The chaos at Fallowfield in 1893 was not entirely unprecedented. Big football crowds had been causing problems for several years, but it was a particularly dramatic illustration of the problem. Contemporary reports describe spectators breaking through barriers, the police being overwhelmed, sections of the crowd standing on the pitch itself while the game was being played. One report describes the referee stopping the match at least twice to clear the touchlines. How the game was completed at all is something of a mystery. The FA drew two lessons from Fallowfield. First, it needed a bigger venue. Second, it needed a venue with better crowd management infrastructure. Both lessons pointed toward Crystal Palace, which would host the final from 1895 and which, with its vast open terraces and its experience of handling large exhibitions and events, was better equipped than anywhere else available. Everton's defeat in this final was the beginning of a long and painful relationship between that club and the FA Cup. They would reach several more finals without winning one, accumulating a record that their supporters found increasingly hard to bear. But in 1893 they had simply been beaten by a better Wolves side on the day. Harry Allen's goal, a clean, well-struck finish, was the difference. Wolves, for their part, celebrated their first ever FA Cup win with tremendous enthusiasm. They were a club with deep roots in the Wolverhampton community, founded in 1877 by pupils at St. Luke's School, and the cup win was the culmination of 15 years of growth and development. Their captain, Harry Wood, lifted the trophy to roars from the Wolverhampton contingent in the Fallowfield crowd. They might not have been able to hear him over the general din of 45,000 people, but they tried. Final score: Wolverhampton Wanderers 1, Everton 0. A vast crowd of 45,000 crammed into Fallowfield Stadium in Manchester for the first cup final to be held outside London. The stadium no longer exists, having been demolished in 1998, and nothing remains. A solitary plaque commemorates the location of the ground. The 23rd FA Cup, season 1893-94. Notts County won the cup for the first and only time in their history, beating Bolton Wanderers 4-1 in a final played at Goodison Park, Everton's ground in Liverpool, a proper football ground, designed by the most famous stadium architect of the era, Archibald Leach. This is a true sign of how big the competition had become, football hosting football at a venue purpose-built for the sport. Notts County's win is one of the great underdog stories of the early cup. They weren't the most fashionable club, they weren't the most powerful, but on the day they were magnificent. Jimmy Logan scored a hat-trick, the second hat-trick in an FA Cup final, following William Townley's in 1890. Logan's 3 goals put County in commanding control. Bolton simply couldn't live with the pace and precision of County's attacks. Bolton were devastated. They'd be back. Bolton would become a significant cup side in the early 20th century. They won it 3 times in the 1920s. But for now, it was County's day. County's win also illustrated something important. The FA Cup, unlike the Football League, could throw up surprises. The best team in the league wouldn't necessarily win the cup. There was something random, something glorious and unpredictable about a knockout competition, And it was this unpredictability, this sense that anyone might beat anyone on the day, that made the FA Cup so compelling. Jimmy Logan's hat-trick in this final deserves at least as much attention as Townley's in 1890, and gets considerably less. Logan was a Scottish forward who had come to Notts County via the usual route of the era, identified in Scotland, brought south with the promise of work and football. He was fast, direct, and had a clinical finishing instinct that made him among the most dangerous attackers in the Football League. His 3 goals in the final, scored against a Bolton side that had been strong throughout the competition, were textbook centre-forward play. First he ran on to a through ball and finished calmly. Then he met a cross with a header. Then, with the game already won, he cut inside from the right and drove the ball past the keeper. 3 different types of goal, 3 different qualities displayed. It was a virtuoso performance on the biggest stage. Bolton Wanderers went home to start planning for next year. They were a club in the ascent, and their time would come in the 1920s. 3 cup wins in the Edwardian and interwar eras. But in 1894 it was Counties Day. Goodison Park, newly constructed, hosted 37,000 spectators in relative comfort. Football was investing in itself. The infrastructure was catching up with the passion. Final score, Notts County 4, Bolton Wanderers 1. 37,000 supporters were at Goodison Park in Liverpool to see County produce one of the great cup final performances. The 24th FA Cup, season 1894-95. Aston Villa once again beat West Bromwich Albion in another Midlands derby. 1-0 in the final, this time at Crystal Palace in South London, which would become the home of the cup final for the next generation. A huge ground, purpose-built in a sense for large crowds, able to hold tens of thousands of people. The road to the 1895-96 final for Sheffield Wednesday had taken them through several challenging rounds. They beat Sunderland, who by 1896 were one of the most powerful clubs in England, League champions, in 1896 were one of the most powerful club, and it gave Wednesday enormous confidence going into the final. They knew, having beaten the league's dominant force, that they were capable of beating anyone. For Wolverhampton Wanderers, reaching the final represented a significant achievement in its own right. They'd won the cup in 1893 and were establishing themselves as one of the most consistent clubs in English football. Their striker, Billy Beats, had been outstanding throughout the competition, and their defence was well organised. They came to Crystal Palace as genuine contenders, not as underdogs. The match itself was a tight, well-contested affair for the most part. Spixley's opener settled Wednesday's nerves. Wolves' equaliser set up a tense second half that could have gone either way, and then Spixley struck again, and the cup was Wednesday's. The scenes at Crystal Palace afterwards. The Sheffield supporters streaming onto the pitch, the Wednesday players hugging each other, the trophy being raised to the pale April sky, were the culmination of everything this competition had been building toward over 25 years. The Crystal Palace ground, not the modern football club's ground, but the ground near the old Crystal Palace exhibition building in Sydenham, was an extraordinary space, sweeping open terraces, spectacular views across London. The kind of venue that made even a nervous spectator feel they were part of something grand. The Crystal Palace building itself, the great iron and glass exhibition hall built for the Great Exhibition of 1851 and moved to Sydenham, dominated the skyline nearby, a monument to Victorian ambition and ingenuity. Holding the cup final in its shadow felt almost symbolic. The people's game in the shadow of the Empire's proudest achievement. The ground had enormous natural terracing on its hillside site, which allowed far more spectators to watch than any purpose-built ground of the era could accommodate. People stood on the slopes, looking down at the pitch below. The sightlines were imperfect, but the atmosphere was magnificent. On a clear April day, you could apparently see St. Paul's Cathedral from the upper terraces. The cup final at Crystal Palace became, in the 1890s and early 1900s, one of the great social events of the English sporting calendar, not just for football fans, but for those who attended, because it was the place to be seen on cup final day. The attendance was over 42,000. The cup final was now the biggest single sporting event in England. Nothing else came close. Villa's winning goal was scored by Bob Chatt, who also has the distinction of scoring the fastest ever cup final goal at the time. His goal came within the first minute of the match and settled it early. West Brom, who'd expected a contest, found themselves chasing the game before they'd had a chance to settle. But 1895 also brought the Great Cup scandal. The Little Tin Idol, the original trophy, the one that had been presented at every final since 1872, was stolen from the Birmingham shop window of William Shillcock, the football manufacturer where Villa had put it on display. It was never recovered. A replacement trophy was made, which served until it was retired in 1910. From 1911 we see the first incarnation of the cup we all know and love, the current FA Cup trophy, which itself was replaced by a replica in 1992, and again in 2014 where the trophy is slightly heavier. There were rumours for years about what happened to the original. One story, told by an old man on his deathbed in the 1950s, claimed it had been melted down to make counterfeit coins, but the truth was never established. The Little Tin Idol is gone forever. If you date from pre-decimalisation, you could well have had a small part of it in your pocket. For Aston Villa, this was just the beginning. They were building toward what would be their greatest ever season, 1896-97, when they'd win the double. But that's outside our 25 Cup window. For now, let's note that Villa had arrived as a footballing superpower. West Brom, losing a final for the third time, must have been developing something of a complex about Villa specifically. The theft of the cup was, in its way, a fitting end to the first era of the competition. The Little Tin Idol, the original trophy, £20 worth of Sheffield silverware, had been the physical embodiment of the cup since 1872. It had been won by Wanderers and Royal Engineers and Oxford University, by Old Etonians and Old Carthusians, by Blackburn Olympic and Blackburn Rovers, by Preston and West Brom and Aston Villa and Wolves and Notts County. It had sat for brief triumphant periods in drawing rooms and committee rooms and clubhouses across England. And now it was gone. The story told by an 83-year-old man to a newspaper in 1958, claiming the trophy had been melted down to make counterfeit half-crowns, is probably apocryphal. It came far too late to be verifiable, and has the quality of legend rather than fact. What is certainly true is that the trophy was never recovered, and that William Shillcock, from whose shop window it was taken, was held liable by the FA for a replacement trophy. Shillcock, understandably, felt this was somewhat unfair. Bob Chatt's goal, scored within 30 seconds of kickoff, which made it the fastest goal in Cup final history to that point, was one of those moments that changes a match before either side is settled. Villa's players celebrated wildly. West Brom's players looked at each other in something approaching disbelief. For the next 89.5 minutes, Villa defended their lead with discipline and organisation. Villa's manager at this point was effectively their committee, led by William MacGregor, the same man who had founded the Football League. Villa were, by any measure, the most professionally run club in England. Final score: Aston Villa 1, West Bromwich Albion 0. A massive crowd of 42,560 made the trip to Crystal Palace for yet another meeting between these two great Midlands rivals. The 25th FA Cup, season 1895-96. And here we are, the 25th FA Cup. A quarter of a century of this extraordinary competition. Sheffield Wednesday win, beating Wolverhampton Wanderers 2-1 at Crystal Palace. Sheffield Wednesday, the Owls, formed in 1867, one of the oldest clubs in the world, by members of the Wednesday Cricket Club who wanted something to do in winter. They'd had their heartbreaking 6-0 defeat to Blackburn way back in 1890. But now, 25 years into the competition's history, they claimed their first title, and they did it in style. The final at Crystal Palace was watched by 48,836 people. Compare that to the Oval in 1872. This is the growth of the FA Cup in 25 years. The growth of football in 25 years. Extraordinary. What had begun as a small private competition among London gentlemen had become the defining event of the English sporting year, watched by tens of thousands of working people who travelled from across the country to be there. Fred Spixley was Wednesday's hero, scoring both goals. A fast, tricky outside left, Spixley was one of the most exciting players in England in the mid-1890s. He was also a fine international for England, winning 7 caps. His 2 goals in the final, the first opening the scoring, the second securing the win after Wolves had pulled one back, were the kind of individual match-winning performances that the FA Cup exists to produce. Wolves gave as good as they got for long stretches. They equalised, forcing tension into the second half. But Wednesday found a way, as the great teams always do. Sheffield, the great footballing city, the city that invented the rules, the city that had given the world the first football club, had its trophy at last. Fred Spixley was not just a cup winner in 1896. He was one of the defining players of the era, and his story is worth telling in a little detail. Born in Gainsborough in Lincolnshire in 1870, he'd come to Wednesday in 1891 and immediately established himself as one of the most exciting wingers in English football. He was quick, startlingly quick, the kind of pace that made spectators gasp, and he had the ball control to go with it. As an England international, he won 7 caps and scored 6 goals in those 7 appearances, a remarkable return for a winger of any era. His 2 goals in the 1896 final were very different from each other. The first was a typical Spixley goal. He received the ball wide on the left, cut inside, beat his man, and drove a low shot past the Wolves keeper. The second came later, after Wolves had equalised and the game hung in the balance. A corner, a scramble in the box, and Spixley reacted quickest to force the ball home. The composed first goal and the determined second told you everything about the range of his game. Wolves, for their part, had given everything. Their equaliser, scored by Black, gave them hope of forcing a replay. But Wednesday found something extra. Teams with quality usually do in cup finals, when the pressure is at its most intense and the ordinary resources of a footballer, fitness, technique, tactics, are tested to their limits. Wednesday had quality, and they used it. The Crystal Palace ground, with nearly 49,000 packed in on that April afternoon in 1896, was the largest audience ever assembled for a sporting event in England. Think about what that represents as a conclusion to our 25 Cup journey, from 2,000 curious spectators at a cricket ground in 1872 to 48,836 at the purpose-built National Stadium of Victorian sport. It seemed that football had conquered England. It was about to conquer the world. Final score: Sheffield Wednesday 2, Wolverhampton Wanderers 1. An attendance of 48,836, the largest the competition had ever seen, gathered at Crystal Palace to see Wednesday claim the 25th Cup. And to sum up, the first 25 years. We've heard how a competition which began in a gaslit Victorian world, where the finalists were teams of aristocrats and schoolboys, ended, 25 years later, as a mass spectacle attended by nearly 50,000 working people, won by a professional club from Yorkshire. We've heard how football was transformed from a game of the privileged into the game of the people. We've watched the public school old boys, the Wanderers and the old Etonians and the old Carthusians, fight a brilliant rearguard action before the industrial North simply overwhelmed them. Not through any unfairness, not through anything shameful, through skill, through commitment, through the simple fact that if you pay people to train properly, they get better at what they do. We've heard how the great northern clubs emerge: Blackburn Rovers with their 5 cups and their 3 consecutive titles, Preston with their invincible double, Aston Villa laying the groundwork for their golden era, Sheffield, that great footballing city, finally getting its hands on the trophy. We've watched the FA Cup grow from £20 worth of silver-plated metal presented to 2,000 people in a cricket ground to the defining event of the English sporting calendar. 48,000 at the old Crystal Palace and counting. And we've heard the stories of some extraordinary men. Arthur Kinnaird and his 9 finals, John Goodall and the Invincibles, Jimmy Logan's hat-trick, William Townley, Bob Chatt, Fred Spixley, men whose names are mostly forgotten now but who made history on those long-ago Saturday afternoons. Men who played for the love of it, and then for the money, and then for both at once, and who in doing so helped invent the modern sport. The FA Cup, more than any other English institution, almost, is the story of Victorian England working itself out. The tensions between class and commerce, between amateurism and professionalism, between North and South, between the old world and the new. All of it played out on a football pitch, in front of growing crowds, for a small silver trophy that nobody much thought about when it was commissioned. The men who started this competition had no idea what they were creating. They couldn't have imagined the Crystal Palace crowd of 48,000 from their Oval crowd of 2,000. They couldn't have imagined Blackburn Rovers winning the Cup 5 times, or Preston going through a season unbeaten. They certainly couldn't have imagined that over 150 years later, we'd still be talking about it, still be captivated by it, still be watching the FA Cup with the same mixture of excitement and sentimentality that those Victorian crowds felt when they watched Old Etonians play Blackburn Rovers in 1882. Because the FA Cup has always been about more than football. It's been about who we are, about how we define excellence and fairness and competition, about what we owe to the people who watch us and what we owe to the game itself. The first 25 FA Cups gave us the template, and every FA Cup since, every giant killing, every replay, every penalty shootout, every moment of heartbreak and joy, has been built on that foundation. The revolution started with a silver trophy worth £20 and 15 clubs and a few hundred spectators at a cricket ground in Kennington. And it never stopped. Let me leave you with a few final thoughts. A few things I hope you take away from this journey through the first 25 FA Cups, beyond simply the results and the names and the dates. The first is about the nature of sporting revolutions. We tend, looking back, to see the professionalization of football as inevitable. Of course it was going to happen. Of course the working class was going to take over the game. Of course Blackburn Olympic was going to beat Old Etonians in 1883. But nothing in history is inevitable. The FA could have held the line longer, inevitably. The class war in football could have been more protracted, more damaging, more divisive. It wasn't, largely because enough people on both sides of the argument, including, crucially, men like Arthur Kinnaird on the amateur side, understood that the game's long-term health required inclusion rather than exclusion. That was a choice, and it was the right one. The second thought is about what these 25 cups tell us about identity. Every one of the clubs in our story represents a community. Wanderers represented the rootless but well-connected world of Victorian gentleman's sport. Royal Engineers represented the professional military. Old Etonians represented the aristocracy. Darwin represented a specific Lancashire mill town. Blackburn Rovers represented Blackburn. Preston represented Preston. Aston Villa represented a specific corner of Birmingham. And when these clubs played against each other, the matches were about more than football. They were negotiations between these communities about status, about respect, about whose way of life deserved celebration. The FA Cup was a theatre in which Victorian England argued about itself. The third thought is simpler. Football is beautiful. Not always, not every game, not every season. But the kind of football produced by the great Preston side, by the passing revolution pioneered by Queen's Park and adopted by the Lancashire clubs, by the individual brilliance of Ottaway and Kinnaird and Spixley, it was beautiful. People watched these matches and felt something. They travelled long distances and paid money they could barely afford and stood in muddy fields in the rain because watching a well-executed passing, move or a perfectly timed tackle or a ball curling into the top corner produced in them a pleasure that nothing else quite replicated. That feeling, that specific pleasure of watching football done well, is exactly the same feeling that 48,836 people felt at Crystal Palace, that millions of people feel watching football today. The game changes. The players are bigger, faster, technically more sophisticated than anything Victorian England could have imagined. The tactical systems that Soudel and his contemporaries developed in the 1880s, the 2-3-5 formation, the passing game, the organized press, would be unrecognizable to a modern eye as the tactical forerunner of what we watch today. But they are. Every tactical innovation since has been built on the discovery those Victorian players made, that 11 men working together as a coherent unit will always in the long run beat 11 individuals working alone. The grounds are unrecognizably different. The money involved is on a scale that would have seemed like fantasy to William Siddell or Arthur Kinnaird. But the feeling, the pure pleasure of watching a brilliant team at their best, is identical to what those first spectators felt at the Oval in 1872. That continuity, more than anything else, is the FA Cup's greatest achievement. It is a thread connecting 1872 to 2026. Connecting Morton Pato Betts scoring at the Oval to the most recent Cup winners, lifting the new trophy at Wembley. Connecting all those muddy afternoons, and all those goal scorers, and all those replays, and all those shocks and upsets and moments of heartbreak and joy. The little tin idol is gone, but the competition endures. The template set in 1871 holds, and it will hold, I suspect, for another 150 years and beyond. That is the story of the first 25 FA Cups. Thank you for listening, and if you've stayed awake this long, well, it seems I've not done my job. Take care, sleep well, and have a great tomorrow.